The Petit family was indeed seen as a model family, fulfilling the best expectations with their stable economic background and exemplary children. They were genuinely admired by those around them. The father, William Petit, was born and raised in Connecticut and stood out in almost every sport during high school, particularly in basketball, where he was a natural leader. In addition to his athletic prowess, he was also the most intelligent of his class, as evidenced by his completion of the law degree at Dartmouth University. However, his true calling was not law. He wanted to help people, care for the sick, and make the world a better place. So, after graduating, he decided to pursue a career in medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. During his third year of residency at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, William met Jennifer Hawk, a nurse in the oncology area and co-director of the health center of a pre-graduate internship. They soon fell in love, and those who knew them affirmed they were perfect for each other. They got married in 1985. 4 years later, they welcomed their first daughter, Haley, and the pregnancy spurred them to form a large family, leading them to buy a house in Cheshire, Connecticut. On November 17, 1995, their second daughter, Michaela, was born. After recovering from childbirth, Jennifer continued her work as a nurse and co-director of the internship. Unfortunately, she later developed multiple sclerosis, an incurable disease she battled for the rest of her life. However, her family never ceased to support her. At the age of 10, their eldest daughter began fundraising for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, which would raise significant funds over the years. Michaela also excelled academically and planned to take over the fundraising efforts when her sister went to college to continue helping her community. She had spent the summer learning to cook and often enjoyed preparing meals for her family. Tragically, this routine activity would lead the family to a fateful encounter with the perpetrator. One July night in 2007, Michaela was preparing dinner for her family, but needed more ingredients for her recipe, so she and her mother went to the nearest market. At the same place was Joshua Komisarjevsky, who had recently been released from prison. Komisarjevsky's childhood was traumatic and complicated. Born to teenage parents, he was put up for adoption a week after birth by his mother and was adopted by the Komisarjevsky family, known for their reputation as distinguished artists in Europe. They were a religious family and very strict with him. Despite his high IQ, he struggled in school, leading his parents to homeschool him. During his trial, he claimed that he was sexually abused by a cousin in his childhood, but his family chose to keep it quiet. This led him to develop a rebellious and chaotic personality. By the age of 14, Joshua Komisarjevsky had been accused of abusing his sister, and it was around this time that he committed his first burglary, marking the start of his career as a thief. In 2002, he was arrested for the first time on 18 charges of burglary and theft, and was subsequently sentenced to 9 years in prison. During the trial, he made a chilling statement, saying, "I like to listen to people while they sleep. I like the feeling of invading their privacy and security." He was released on parole in 2007 at the age of 27. Officials in charge considered him a danger to society, being the calculating criminal with perverted tendencies. However, the jury did not heed the warnings and declared Joshua ostensibly fit for release. After his release, he stayed in a residence for ex-convicts, where he met his accomplice, Stephen Hayes. Hayes had spent a significant portion of his life in prison, first being incarcerated at the age of 16 in the year 1980. Over the years, he was frequently arrested for violent robbery and burglary. He was sentenced in 2004 and again granted parole in 2006, which led him to the same halfway house where he met Komisarjevsky. Returning to the night of July 22, 2007, Michaela Petit was preparing dinner for her family, but realized she needed more ingredients for her recipe. She asked her mother to take her to the nearest market to shop. Little did they know they were being observed by Komisarjevsky, who meticulously noted every detail, the make and model of their vehicle, their faces, and Michaela's blonde hair. After shopping, The Petit family returned home, unaware that they were being followed. Shortly afterwards, Hayes sent a text message to Komisarjevsky that read, "I'm chomping at the bit to get started. Meet a margarita soon." Hayes then texted, "We still on?" Komisarjevsky replied, "Yes." Hayes' next text asked, "Soon?" To which Komisarjevsky replied, "I'm putting the kid to bed, hold your horses." Hayes replied, "Dude, the horses want to get loose." Komisarjevsky discreetly trailed the family in his car, learning the exact location of their home before withdrawing from the scene. The family enjoyed what seemed like a peaceful and normal dinner, unaware that it would be their last moment together. In the early hours, while everyone slept except for the father, William Petit, who had dozed off in the living room, their peace was shattered by strange noises inside the house. The next thing William remembered was a sense of grogginess, pain, and an inability to formulate a coherent thought. Komisarjevsky and Hayes had entered the house through an unlocked door and initially planned to rob the family. However, the night took a tragic turn. They found a baseball bat in the house and used it to repeatedly beat William, who remained conscious despite the assault. He heard one of the intruders say, "If he moves, shoot him." William was then tied up with zip ties and ropes, immobilized and bound to a pole in the basement. The intruders then went upstairs to find Haley's room, where she was sleeping. Haley and Michaela Petit were tied by their hands and feet to their bedposts, and their heads were covered with pillowcases. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Jennifer Petit had fallen asleep. The intruders quietly entered the room and woke her up. Without much effort, they tied Jennifer's hands and feet. Feeling in control of the house, the intruders took their time to inspect it, even smoking cigarettes in the living room. After collecting jewelry, cash, and other valuables, they decided to leave. It seemed the ordeal was over for the Petit family as they heard the burglars leaving. However, their torment was far from over. After selling the stolen items at a pawn shop and realizing they hadn't gotten as much money as expected, the ex-convicts, motivated by greed, decided to return to the house. They then found a check register with $40,000. They decided to steal $15,000. They also had stopped to fill a couple of gasoline cans before returning, as seen in surveillance camera footage. Back at the house, they told Jennifer their plan, threatening to kill her entire family if she didn't cooperate. Desperate but thinking of her daughter's safety, Jennifer agreed to accompany Stephen to the bank the next morning. Meanwhile, Joshua took advantage of Jennifer's absence, entering Michaela's room, untying her, and beginning to undress her. He took photos with his cell phone and assaulted her, recording the act. Afterward, he took her to the bathroom to clean her, ensuring no DNA evidence was left, then ordered her to put her pajamas back on and tie her up again. Evidence that Komisarjevsky raped Michaela came from her autopsy, during which state medical examiner Dr. Wayne Carver found his DNA in her body. At the bank, everything seemingly went well, but Stephen failed to notice what Jennifer did while in the queue. Before approaching the teller, she wrote a note on a flyer asking for help. The note read, "My name is Jennifer Hawk Petit. I need to withdraw $15,000 from my savings account. My family is in danger. Please call the police or they will be killed." The teller decided to give her the money, even though Jennifer had no identification. With the cash in hand, Jennifer left the bank to return to the car with her captor, while the bank employee immediately called the police to report the incident. The manager told the dispatcher of the 911 line that Hawk Petit had indicated that the home invaders were being nice and that she believed they only wanted money. The Cheshire police responded to the bank's report by assessing the situation and setting up a vehicle perimeter, without revealing their presence. The police, now aware of the situation, observed from a distance without intervening. Back at the house, Joshua told his accomplice what he had done to Michaela, suggesting he could do the same to Jennifer. Without hesitation, Stephen subdued Jennifer, pressed her body to the ground, and began to undress her. William was able to hear his wife's assault upstairs. He yelled up and heard one of the invaders say, "Don't worry, it's all gonna be over in a couple of minutes." Meanwhile, William Petit, regaining consciousness and hearing his wife's screams, managed to free himself and crawl to the basement stairs, eventually making it to the backyard. He later said, "I thought, it's now or never, because in my mind at that moment, I thought they were going to shoot all of us." In a minute, Joshua went to check on William, only to find that he had escaped. Hayes said in her confession that while he was raping Hawk Petit on the living room floor, Komisarjevsky entered and announced that William had escaped. Hearing this, Stephen strangled Jennifer to death while continuing to assault her. Soon after, they heard William shouting for help. His neighbor, who initially didn't recognize him due to the injuries, called 911 immediately. Realizing the police would soon be called, the intruders decided to eliminate all evidence. Hayes and Komisarjevsky doused Jennifer's lifeless body and parts of the house, including the daughters' bedrooms and daughters themselves, with gasoline. Investigators would later find the accelerant on the Petit sisters' beds and on the clothing they were wearing. Hayes and Komisarjevsky started a fire and fled the scene. Unaware that the authorities had blocked the area a few miles ahead, they collided with a police vehicle within 5 minutes. After they were surrounded by the police, the two perpetrators were pulled from their vehicle and arrested. They were immediately identified as ex-convicts. Meanwhile, the fire in the house was rapidly growing. An ambulance arrived and transported the gravely injured father, Dr. William Petit, to the nearest hospital. Shortly afterward, firefighters attempted to combat the blaze and, upon extinguishing it, discovered a horrific scene in the remnants of the house. The first body found was that of Jennifer, completely charred with remnants of rope around her ankles. Upon reaching the second floor, they found Michaela tied to her bed, completely consumed by the fire. Haley, surprisingly, had managed to force her restraints and attempted to escape, but collapsed just a few meters away, having inhaled too much smoke. William had been able to free himself of his restraints, exit the house, and crawl to a neighbor's yard for help. The neighbor initially did not recognize him due to the severity of his injuries. Both Hayes and Komisarjevsky confessed to the murders. Detectives testified that Hayes smelled of gasoline throughout her interrogation. Each assailant claimed that the other was the driving force and mastermind behind the home invasion. Komisarjevsky also blamed William for the murders. In Komisarjevsky's diary, which was later entered into evidence, he called William a coward and claimed that he could have saved his family if he wanted to. Stephen Hayes' trial began on September 13, 2010, with a jury of 7 women and 5 men. The defense argued that Joshua Komisarjevsky was the mastermind behind the crime and responsible for escalating its violent nature, while prosecutors held that both Hayes and Komisarjevsky shared responsibility. On October 5, after about 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Hayes guilty. The sentencing phase began on October 18, with the jury initially split over recommending life imprisonment or death. Hayes' defense argued that life imprisonment without parole would be a harsher punishment. On November 8, the jury recommended the death sentence for Hayes on each of the 6 capital felony counts. Hayes had previously attempted to negotiate a plea bargain for a life sentence, but prosecutors sought the death penalty. Dr. William Petit, the sole survivor, commented on the verdict, and the Connecticut State Judicial Branch offered post-traumatic stress assistance to jurors due to the disturbing nature of the trial. For the first time in state history, the Connecticut State Judicial Branch offered post-traumatic stress assistance to jurors who served for 2 months on the triple murder trial because they had been required to look at disturbing images and hear grisly testimony. On December 2, 2010, Hayes apologized for the pain and suffering he had caused the Petit family and added that death for me will be a welcome relief, and I hope it will bring some peace and comfort to those who I have hurt so much. Judge John Blue imposed 6 death sentences and an additional 106 years for other crimes. However, Hayes' death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in August 2015 when Connecticut abolished capital punishment. Joshua Komisarjevsky's trial began on September 19, 2011. His attorneys offered a guilty plea in exchange for a life sentence, but prosecutors aimed for the death penalty, arguing that Komisarjevsky was a confused man led by Hayes. Komisarjevsky was found guilty on October 13, 2011, and the jury recommended the death penalty on December 9, 2011. During his sentencing, Komisarjevsky spoke about his shame and hurt caused by the crime, insisting that he did not intend to kill anyone. Judge Blue set July 20, 2012 as Komisarjevsky's execution date, echoing his responsibility for the crime. However, like Hayes, Komisarjevsky's death sentence was converted to life imprisonment in August 2015 after Connecticut abolished the death penalty. The trials and subsequent sentencing of Hayes and Komisarjevsky marked a significant and harrowing chapter in Connecticut's legal history. The brutal nature of the crimes and the trial's emotional toll on all involved, including the jurors, highlighted the complexities and challenges of the legal system in dealing with such heinous acts. Dr. Petit's statements during the trials underscored the lasting impact of the crime on surviving family members and the community, which continues to honor the memory of the victims. The only survivor, Dr. William Petit, was discharged from the hospital 4 days after his admission to attend the funeral of his family. Haunted by guilt and the torment of having survived, he later established a foundation to help children and young victims of violence, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. Subsequently, as a member of the Republican Party, he ventured into politics and became a state representative. The murders of the Petit family left a deep impact on the community, which gathers annually to pay tribute to them. Questions remain among family members and the public about whether the authorities acted correctly in their response to the situation. The time spent by the authorities observing the situation from a distance could have been crucial in preventing the tragedy. On June 7, 1977, the state of Ontario, Canada, witnessed the birth of Leah Sousa. Leah's life began with her strong and determined mother, Laura Sousa, who, despite being the single parent, left no stone unturned in ensuring her daughter's well-being. For a considerable time, their world was just the two of them, journeying through life's highs and lows together. As time unfolded, Laura introduced Leah to her new baby brother, Michael. The identity of their father remains undisclosed to the public. While some believe that a father figure was missing from their lives, the addition of Michael brought a sense of completeness to their family. Living in Cumberland Beach, Ontario, a quaint region about 2 hours away from Toronto, the Souses had a humble abode with a combined living and kitchen area and a single bedroom. But this didn't deter Leah's spirit. She grew into a radiant young girl with a lively sense of humor and zest for life. Leah's academic achievements and her roles as a doting sister and daughter made her family immensely proud. At the age of 13, the Sousa family decided to visit Laura's sister, taking a rejuvenating 6-week summer break. With the Canadian school year commencing the Tuesday after Labor Day, they were soon back in Cumberland Beach, gearing up for the upcoming academic year. As the 1990 Labor Day weekend approached, Leah was eagerly preparing for her impending high school journey. On the night of September 1, while she rested on the couch, Laura and baby Michael slept peacefully in the bedroom. But that tranquility was shattered when, between 1:30 and 3 o'clock a.m., an unknown individual forcibly entered their home. Initially, the intruder brutally attacked Laura, using a metal object to inflict severe head injuries. He then turned his attention to Leah, assaulting her inside the house before dragging her to the backyard for further violence. The following morning, a friend of Leah's grew concerned after failing to reach her by phone. She decided to check on her, cycling over to the Sousa residence. The horrific sight she discovered was beyond comprehension. Leah's lifeless body lay in the backyard amidst a scene of devastation. The police were immediately alerted, and upon arrival, they found Laura grievously injured but alive. The silver lining amidst the tragedy was that young Michael remained untouched and unaware of the nightmare that had taken place. Laura was rushed to a Toronto-based hospital, where she spent 3 challenging weeks recuperating under tight security, fearing the perpetrator might return. The extent of her injuries required multiple surgeries, leading to the insertion of metal implants in her skull and cheek. One eye was severely damaged, resulting in lasting issues like impaired vision, dizziness, and diminished hearing. The brutal attack on Leah and her mother, who miraculously survived, profoundly shook both law enforcement and the residents of the rural community. In a place where people once led peaceful lives, leaving doors and windows open and letting children cycle freely without any fear, panic began to permeate the air. Parents became hesitant to let their children play outdoors, preferring to keep them close and in sight. Locking doors, securing windows, and keeping weapons nearby for self-defense became commonplace. In fact, out of sheer fear of a nocturnal assault, many residents started keeping a weapon or tool close to their beds. The palpable fear was evident on the faces of the community members. Investigators tirelessly worked to shed light on the events and identify potential suspects. Even though various samples were collected from the crime scene and inside the home, they couldn't find the assailant's DNA. Neither the weapon used in the crime nor the bloodied clothing the perpetrator wore during the attack was ever found. One key clue emerged: a footprint from a size 9 or 10 Nike tennis shoe made of leather. It was believed that Laura might have seen the attacker, but due to her injuries, she could not recall any events from that night. Investigators theorized that the individual who took Leah's life might have been familiar with the family and their vulnerabilities, noting their secluded living area and the absence of a male figure in the household, a single mother with an infant and a teenage daughter. Furthermore, detectives hypothesized that the attacker knew the region well, possibly being a resident or a frequent visitor, and was aware that the family was alone that particular night. One person of interest identified was Brian Timothy Elson from a nearby town. 4 months after Leah's tragic end, Brian took the life of 17-year-old Sandra Bannister in a place less than 13 kilometers from where the Sousa family lived. While Brian denied any involvement, the police suspected he was in Cumberland Beach on the night of the assault on the Sousa household. However, after questioning, he was released. He was never charged for Leah's murder, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter in Sandra's case, serving only 6 years in prison. After his release, due to concerns about his potential threat, the courts allowed the police to monitor his movements for 3 years, though this led to no further developments. As the authorities persisted in their investigations, Laura grappled with the gaps in her memory. Eager to recall the events of that fateful night, she tried various methods, including hypnosis and the controversial use of sodium pentothal, commonly known as truth serum. However, these attempts were in vain. Later, she turned to a renowned expert in brain science in Ontario. He attempted to stimulate Laura's damaged right brain hemisphere with magnetic fields to retrieve memories. Sadly, this effort also failed. He explained that human memories don't instantly solidify. Experiences take 20 to 30 minutes to permanently store in our brains. Unfortunately, during Laura's attack, this critical window was lost. He compared it to shutting down a computer without saving, suggesting that the memory might be lost forever, a heartbreaking outcome for Laura. In 2008, Ontario Provincial Police launched a billboard campaign along the highway near the Sousa residence, seeking new leads on Leah's case. This initiative yielded some promising testimonials. That same year, an intriguing tip led to an extensive search for the murder weapon on a wooded property in Cumberland Beach. However, the search came up empty, and Leah's case remained unresolved. In 2010, marking the 20th anniversary of the crime, the news program ran a feature on Leah's case. During their investigation, they found out that Brian's grandmother, a person of significant interest in the case due to her association with another similar attack, lived on the same street as the Sousa at the time of the incident. Brian was reportedly staying with her during that period. When a reporter located Brian at his home and questioned him about the assault leading to Leah's death, he denied any involvement. He claimed he was at a party in another town that night, where 60 witnesses could confirm his alibi. Over the decades since the murder, more than 1,500 people have been interviewed by the police. The quest for answers in Leah's tragic case continues. On one occasion, Laura spoke to the media, expressing her growing concerns that the case might never be solved. However, she maintained hope that one day she would come to know what transpired and why. The grieving mother pleaded with the community not to forget her daughter. Even though she couldn't remember the events of that fateful night, the haunting memories continued to torment her, and she wasn't the only one scared by the tragic events of the summer night in 1990. Officers who investigated Leah's case, along with the journalists who covered it, acknowledged the horror that continued to grip them. By 2020, an investigator of the Ontario Provincial Police, the last in a series of investigators who had been on the case since Labor Day 1990, described the brutality as off the charts. He stated that both mother and daughter, deep in sleep, stood no chance against the attacker as they were ambushed and severely beaten. At that point, he revealed that the police believed a pipe or an iron wrench might have been the weapon used by the assailant. Yet they held back further investigative details to avoid jeopardizing the case. Regrettably, as the years since Leah's assault and the severe injuries inflicted on her mother, Laura, passed, the mystery of that night remained unsolved. More than 2 decades after the incident, the police reiterated that there were individuals who had information about the events and could potentially help solve the case. Despite a reward offer of $50,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator, that crucial piece of evidence never materialized. Still, they encouraged anyone who believed they had even the slightest information to come forward. Jim Van Allen, a criminal profiler with the Ontario Provincial Police, had studied around 850 fatal assaults before retiring in 2010. He dedicated significant years of his career trying to understand the motives behind heinous crimes and how to prevent them. When discussing Leah's case, he stated that while all violent deaths are tragic, some, like Leah's, are unforgettable. To Jim, the crime scene, which looked like a dollhouse in a tidy 60-square-meter space without a basement, suggested that the attack was personal and intimate. Given that the family had only recently moved in and only locals knew they were home, he surmised that the aggressor was local and likely acted alone. In Jim's analysis, the intruder, equipped with a metal tool to break a window pane, likely had a sinister plan for the night. The level of violence exhibited indicated the act wasn't just a random outburst, but rather a manifestation of deep-seated sadism. Jim hypothesized that the assailant, already predisposed to violence, might have been at a personal breaking point, possibly under the influence and driven by a lifetime of resentments. He pondered if the man had a recent argument or felt particularly humiliated that day, suggesting past humiliations could have acted as a trigger for his rage. The profiler believed that the attacker might have known Laura and been interested in her. However, as a single mother, she would have been out of his league, like many other women. Jim's analysis suggested that while the intruder was likely known in the community, he wasn't particularly well-liked, leading women to instinctively fear him. From Jim's assessment, while criminals typically flee their localities after committing heinous acts, he felt Leah's assailant might have remained nearby. Perhaps he cleaned his stained clothes and discarded the metallic instrument. The attacker's potential financial constraints and limited resources might have dictated this choice. Though not exceptionally astute, the culprit had the cunning to remain silent. In Jim's professional estimation, this person showed no regret for Leah's untimely death and likely felt indifferent about Laura's fortunate survival. But all these speculations and years of persistent investigation couldn't bring them any closer to the elusive perpetrator. In a twist in 2014, Barry Rule, an ex-officer of the Ontario Provincial Police with 3 decades of service, unveiled a book named A Viable Suspect: Multiple Murders and the Limits of a Police Force in Canada's Most Noted Unsolved Mystery. Barry's narrative raised suspicions about a serial criminal, dubbed Larry Towlett in his writings, connecting him to Leah's demise and other similar incidents in southwest Ontario. A personal encounter with this man named Larry in 1971 was recounted by Barry, wherein Larry trespassed and assaulted his fiancée. This attack was thwarted by Barry, who noticed the intruder's method of entry. Breaking a rear window resembled the approach at the Sousa residence. Larry, known as a traveling salesman in southwest Ontario, had his vehicle inspected, revealing a rape kit. Yet, regardless of Barry's insights into recurring patterns, Larry escaped intense scrutiny and passed away without ever being a legally recognized suspect. Even as Barry's book garnered attention, it didn't decisively resolve the cases hinting at Larry's involvement. Commemorating the 25th year of Leah's tragic end in 2015, Laura echoed sentiments of profound sorrow and exasperation, mourning the stolen potential of Leah's life. Investigators, over the years, left no stone unturned, pursuing leads, deploying multimedia investigations, revisiting evidence, and meticulously studying the comprehensive case files, among the most voluminous in police records. With the belief that someone local held the key to unlocking Leah's murder mystery, the police broadcasted a plea for information, spotlighting a $50,000 reward. Leah's mother lamented that even after years, she couldn't recollect the events of that devastating night. The knowledge that clues about the identity of the assailant responsible for Leah's tragic end were locked away in her memory was tormenting. Driving past the house became a somber task for many in the community. Paul Petit spoke about the profound impact this incident had on their lives. Even though he never knew Leah personally, the chilling details of her fate left him and his peers deeply shaken. Parents became overly cautious, restricting their children's outdoor activities. In a time without the rapid information spread of social media, whispers of fear propagated through the community. A new detective took over the case in 2019, and he has been diligently collaborating with experts from similar past cases. The case file, vast and complex, demanded exhaustive scrutiny to uncover any overlooked evidence. Though he didn't divulge specifics on whether they believed a single individual or multiple were involved, he emphasized the continual re-examination of evidence from 1990, thanks to modern forensic methods. Even after over 30 years, the brutal demise of Leah Sousa remains an unresolved mystery. The collective efforts of the community and law enforcement have yet to bring the perpetrator to justice. This harrowing case serves as a grim reminder to the community about the imperativeness of vigilance and unity. Authorities, meanwhile, are unwavering in their quest for justice. Leah's memory remains etched in the community, continually underscoring the importance of justice and safety for all. The story of Rachel Marie Runyan began on June 23, 1979, when she was born in the serene landscapes of Weber County, Utah, United States. She was the only girl in the family of Jeff and Elaine Runyan. The couple's firstborn was named Justin, and the youngest child was Nathan. The 3 siblings lived in harmony, promising laughter and shared memories. According to reviews of her life in 1981, Rachel, with her innate grace, the 2-year-old girl, ascended to the realm of childhood royalty by being crowned Little Miss Sunset. With her golden hair and radiant smile, she captivated attention at every local event. But little Rachel not only had physical beauty, her inner nobility was much greater according to her mother Elaine. She was a gentle and kind girl who was often seen on the periphery of playgrounds. She was extremely observant and analytical. and knew how to stay away from the rough games between Justin and the other boys. She had the habit of sucking her thumb while observing the mischief of others. That gave her an even sweeter and also funny appearance, which aroused much sympathy. Her mother occasionally teased her about her future, predicting that she would have rabbit or beaver teeth, to which Rachel responded with a naughty giggle. The Runyan family chose to settle in Sunset, a community only about 6,000 inhabitants back then, which seemed a safe paradise to raise their children. Their modest home was located near the Doxy Elementary School playground. For the three little Runyans, that park became their place of laughter and fun. Trusting that they were doing their best for their children, Jeff and Elaine decided to install a gate in the fence of their own yard, opening a direct passage to the favorite place site of the three children. Despite the apparent tranquility of Sunset, Jeff and Elaine were always vigilant, tirelessly warning their children about the risks of trusting strangers. They insisted on the importance of staying in safe places and, above all, taught them never to follow someone unknown, no matter what they offered. Their commitment to their children's safety was unquestionable. In the late morning of August 26, 1982, 3-year-old Rachel, her brother Nathan, and the eldest 5-year-old Justin asked their mother for a simple request. They wanted her permission to go to the playground of Doxy Elementary School, less than 5 meters from their home. Although Elaine had always been cautious about letting her children play without her supervision, the proximity of the playground and the need to finish preparing lunch led her to agree to the request. As no precautions seemed excessive to her, the mother watched them from the kitchen window while preparing food. However, when lunchtime came around at approximately 12:55 p.m., only Nathan and Justin returned home. The voice of little Justin trembled as he told his mother what had happened moments before. He described how a young man had forcibly taken Rachel from the park. The man first attempted to lure all three children, promising ice creams and chewing gums from a nearby store. While playing in the open air, the man approached them, trying to persuade them to get into his car, claiming to have the gum-flavored ice cream they longed for. In hell innocence, Rachel mentioned her favorite ice cream flavor, and Justin, acting as the protective older brother, warned his sister not to pay attention to the stranger's offer. Then Rachel started to walk away, but the man was quicker, roughly grabbing and carrying her over his shoulder, silencing her screams as he took her to his vehicle. Justin and Nathan, paralyzed by fear, hadn't fully recovered when their mother called them to eat. Instantly, Elaine found herself in the midst of her worst nightmare. With her heart racing, she hurried to the store the man mentioned, questioning employees and shoppers with heartbreaking urgency. However, her inquiries yielded no results. No one remembered seeing Rachel or the man. 20 minutes after Rachel's disappearance, Elaine was at the Sunset Police Department, sporting the kidnapping. With immense distress, Elaine barely managed to speak, and the search for answers became a painful and uncertain journey. The Sunset Police acted promptly, initiating a plan involving vehicle checks around the city. Despite their efforts, the suspect was not apprehended, nor was Rachel recovered. With time pressing, a special team of 10 investigators from various law enforcement agencies in Utah gathered under the direction of Sheriff Brant Johnston, intending to solve the child's mysterious abduction. Descriptions provided by Justin and another 10-year-old child at the park gave investigators critical details. They described a light-skinned African-American man, around 30 to 35 years old, with distinctive afro hair and a marked mustache. He drove an old dark blue 4-door vehicle, embellished with wooden strips on the sides. This man had been seen in the park, interacting with various children and having a cup of coffee for at least 15 minutes before taking Rachel against her will. His strategy was to avoid immediate alarm and prevent children from screaming in his presence by engaging them in playful activities. The children's sharp memories allowed the police to create a detailed composite sketch. However, the three children were the only direct witnesses, as no security camera have recorded the incident in the school playground. Despite persistent calls by a police and the media, no one reported seeing a man with those characteristics. Subsequent efforts by the law enforcement agencies involved forensic analysis and rigorous door-to-door investigations supported by a committee of neighbors, many of whom offered monetary contributions for an improvised search. The Runyan family embarked on a heartbreaking journey to find their beloved daughter. With limited resources but unwavering will, both the family and the community volunteers launched various methods to find Rachel. A national flyer campaign displaying the girl's image was meticulously orchestrated, and friends and neighbors joined in a race against time, calming local neighborhoods in a frantic search. The case of Rachel Runyan saw thousands of missing person posters disseminated to raise public awareness regarding her disappearance. The public's response was overwhelming, providing investigators with myriad clues about Rachel's possible location and the potential identity of the abductor. Despite the determination in pursuing every lead, the outcomes were predominantly disheartening. A week after the harrowing disappearance, Rachel's parents, Jeff and Elaine, traveled to New York to attend a press conference with the intent to sustain media attention and emphasize the urgency of their daughter's return. Jeff, in a courageous plea, conveyed the profound damage the abductor had inflicted on their daughter and themselves, urging anyone with information to come forward. Elaine, with visible anguish, suggested the possibility of Rachel being sold after her abduction, and she appealed to potential adoptive parents to ensure they were not adopting her missing daughter. The family's relentless dedication was soon met with a harsh reality of mounting financial costs, reaching $10,000 in postage expenses alone within 3 weeks. The long-term sustainability of such immense physical, emotional, and financial exertion was seemingly impossible. On September 3rd, the distressed parents brought their appeals to the Today Show, offering a reward of $20,000, primarily sourced from community donations, aiming to gather more information on Rachel's whereabouts. The community of Sunset demonstrated immense solidarity, contributing an additional $20,000 to the reward, totaling $40,000, a substantial incentive for Rachel's safe return at that time. The unexpected discovery on September 19, 1982, obliterated the enduring hopes of those searching for Rachel and left her loved one's heart broken. A family traveling in Mountain Green, Utah, discovered the partially covered body of a small girl, later identified as Rachel, despite the advanced decomposition. The mystery surrounding her death persisted, as the exact cause remained undetermined, with asphyxiation not ruled out. Following the painful confirmation of Rachel's fate, Jeff and Elaine organized a proper farewell, attended by over 300 people. Rachel was finally laid to rest at the Washington Heights Memorial Park in Ogden, Utah. In the midst of devastation, Elaine transformed her pain into efficacy for child safety and legal improvements for child abduction cases, fostering awareness and change in a world that had brought her immeasurable sorrow. With her heart shattered but resolve unbroken, Elaine became a steadfast support, offering counsel, guidance, and solace to other parents plunged into the turmoil of their children's disappearances. As accounts of this case highlight, Rachel's legacy surpassed her individual tragedy. Her kidnapping and the horrifying manner of her death echoed through the halls of power, serving as catalysts for substantial change. In October 1982, legislation was enacted at the federal level, granting parents of missing children access to an information exchange hub managed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. This hub began accumulating and archiving fingerprint and blood-type records of over 300,000 children from Utah, aiming to forge an indispensable resource in combating child abductions. It may seem grim to assert that the agonizing loss of Rachel to an unapprehended abductor wasn't futile, but that is indeed the case. The state of Utah introduced the Rachel Alert System in April 2002. Intended to notify residents about active child abduction and missing children cases, this system emerged as a ray of hope. It was only initiated when rigorous criteria were fulfilled, such as the child being a minor or mentally disabled, immediate danger, and not running away voluntarily. Detailed physical descriptions of the child were also mandatory. The Rachel Alert was activated only twice, during the disappearance of Elizabeth Smart in June 2002 and the kidnapping of Nicholas Triplett, a 3-month-old, in January 2003. Both children were eventually recovered alive. After Elizabeth Smart's safe return, realizing the efficacy of such alert systems, 41 states adopted the Amber Alert System, named for another girl, Amber Haderman. In April 2003, Utah transitioned from the Rachel Alert to the Amber Alert System to comply with national standards. However, this didn't signify that the 3-year-old would be forgotten. To honor her memory, the Attorney General's office instituted the Rachel Runyan Award for citizens who aid in recovering a child by contacting the law enforcement when an alert is issued. Elaine was also invited to participate in the award ceremonies. Currently, the Amber Alert System undergoes testing twice a year in Utah on January 13 and August 26, the dates marking the anniversary of Rachel's abduction. Although Rachel's murderer remains at large in the case unsolved, Lieutenant Phil instead's vow that it will not be forgotten persists. Phil, the first to respond to Elaine's urgent call following her daughter's abduction, has continually supported the Runyan family. Over the years, he repeatedly reassured them of Sunset Police Department's unwavering commitment to find the individual responsible for Rachel's abduction and subsequent tragic death. In 2007, the case was officially reopened, and the police have been collaborating closely with the Utah Attorney General's office in their quest to apprehend and bring the perpetrator to justice. At the time, a $58,000 reward was offered to anyone delivering information, leading to the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator. With the reward seemingly not alluring enough to elicit crucial information, hopes of identifying the perpetrator are heavily dependent on substantial advancements in forensic technology since 1982. Strategies like the potential exhumation of Rachel's body to collect more evidence were also considered. In 2007, DNA testing on items found near the location of the remains provided initial results, but didn't significantly advance the investigation. Regardless of the hurdles and uncertainties, the Runyan family maintains hope that justice will eventually be served. The scope of suspects has varied over the years. In 2012, it was disclosed that focus was on an inmate in a Pennsylvania prison, a former resident of Sunset in 1982. While no formal charges were levied against him, he was deemed a person of interest in relation to the little girl's kidnapping and homicide. Another potential suspect is a man with a criminal background located in New Mexico. Chief Ken Aborn of Sunset Police has noted that evidence does point toward this individual's possible guilt, but it's currently inadequate for a formal arrest. Despite the obstacles, the quest for justice for Rachel is ongoing, and the resolve of her family and the authorities remains unyielding. In May 2016, the park, a silent witness to her abduction, was renamed Rachel Runyan Memorial Park. On August 26, during a ceremony filled with emotion, it became a tangible tribute to the little girl's memory. Her commemorative stone, bearing her image and a brief recount of her story, stands within the park's boundaries, the engraving on the stone commemorating her short-lived life. This was not the only significant act in Rachel's memory. In March 2017, Rachel Runyan's Missing and Exploited Children's Day became law in Utah. aiming to emphasize child safety in the community annually, inspired by Rachel's story. In 2019, there was renewed hope in Rachel's case when private investigator Jason Jensen began working with the Runyan family. Jensen, co-founder of Utah's Cold Case Coalition, focused on a different crime from the 1970s. Witnesses in this unrelated case had provided incorrect information about the suspect's appearance, leading Jason to reconsider the descriptions given in Rachel's case.
Specifically, he pondered if Justin, Rachel's brother, could have misinterpreted the racial identity of the abductor due to his young age and the predominantly white neighborhood they lived in, where interactions with African Americans were limited. Jason discussed with Elaine the possibility that Rachel's brother might have observed a Latino man abducting his sister. Justin never associated the abductor with being African American. He remembered him having a dark complexion and a distinct mustache with a gap or separation in the middle. The authorities, however, had prioritized the description provided by another older child present at the park that day. According to Jason, this misinterpretation possibly misdirected the investigation for almost 4 decades. Correcting this information brought the possibility of identifying a new person of interest, bringing the case closer to a possible resolution. Jason also provided more details about the suspect's car, a 1973 blue-painted car with wood panels on the sides, allowing for more focused search efforts. Soon after the release of the updated sketch of the suspect, a woman came forward with a promising lead stating that her uncle, who had a history of sexual assault and abuse and was in and out of prison, resembled the sketch. He had been released from prison in 1981 and lived in the area at the time of Rachel's abduction, driving a blue-painted car with wood panels, exactly like the one Jason thought was used in Rachel's abduction. However, he had passed away, so without a confession or DNA, there wasn't enough evidence to connect him to Rachel's murder. While the police allegedly took a DNA sample from his daughter to compare with the evidence collected in 2007, the results have not been disclosed. Elaine, since the incident, has devoted her life and Rachel's legacy to preventing other children from suffering the same fate by educating children and parents about the dangers of abductions and crimes. Every year, on the anniversary of Rachel's abduction, her family holds small ceremonies at the park from which she was taken. Now named after her, the case remains unsolved, and these events are used to urge the community to approach the Sunset Police if they have any information about her disappearance or the perpetrator's whereabouts.
This horrible case took place in Lausada, a village situated in the northern region of Portugal, a location known for its vineyards, renowned green wine, and its distinction as the youngest population in the country. Nestled in the heart of the municipality bearing the same name, this village is in close proximity to the northwest coast of Portugal, a hub of summer enjoyment for tourists hailing from various corners of Europe. Within this quaint village, on January 28, 1987, Rui Pedro Teixeira was born. His parents, Filomena and Manuel, lauded his lively and jovial nature, along with his remarkable creativity and imagination. In a nutshell, this family, complete with their youngest daughter Karina, led a harmonious and contented life. Rui Pedro was a bundle of energy as a child. After completing his daily school assignments, he engaged in spirited soccer matches with his beloved cousin João André and other local children. His aspiration was to become a professional goalkeeper, and thus he consistently played in that role. Among the boy's other pastimes was cycling, and he could often be spotted zipping through the village to ensure he reached his daily math tutoring sessions punctually. However, one shadow cast over his otherwise serene childhood. Rui Pedro grappled with epilepsy. Manuel and Filomena were the proprietors of a driving school. One day, an ordinary young man named Afonso Diaz arrived at the academy with aspirations of obtaining his driver's license. Filomena swiftly discovered that Afonso was facing financial hardship. Renowned for her exceptional empathy, she immediately sought ways to assist him. Initially, she provided him with clothing, and as their bond deepened, she extended the opportunity for him to work at the school, enabling him to earn extra income. 3 years passed, and thanks to Filomena's kindness, Afonso became a truck driver at just 22 years old. The family trusted Afonso so much that they relied on him to pick up Rui Pedro and Karina from school and bring them back home. To do this, Afonso used his brother's car, a Fiat Uno. As they spent time together every day, an unusual friendship blossomed between Afonso and Rui Pedro. The family didn't think it was strange, especially because Afonso had a youthful and childlike personality, which made him and Rui Pedro feel like brothers. However, the maternal grandparents viewed their relationship with suspicion. Manuel, on the other hand, was concerned about Afonso smoking around the child and considered him a bad influence. Worried about the consequences of this friendship, Manuel talked to Filomena about it, but she was convinced of Afonso's good character and believed he meant no harm. In the end, like in any good marriage, they reached a compromise, with Filomena agreeing to keep an eye on their interactions. On March 4, 1998, around 2 p.m., Rui Pedro rode his bicycle to his mother's workplace, which was just a few blocks away from home, to tell her that Afonso had invited him for a ride in his brother's car. Filomena wasn't happy about the idea and told him not to go. Instead, she sent him to a nearby field where his friends were waiting to play soccer, emphasizing the importance of making it to his 5 p.m. class on time. Though he was initially disappointed, Rui Pedro obeyed. He removed his bicycle helmet and headed to the soccer field. When he arrived, he found his friends, except for João André, whom his mother didn't allow to go out. Surprisingly, a black Fiat Uno driven by Afonso pulled into the field a few minutes later and stopped beside Rui Pedro. They had a short conversation, and then the child put aside his bicycle helmet, got into the car, and bid farewell to his friends through the passenger window with a simple gesture. Between 5 and 6 in the afternoon, a phone call shattered the family's peace and marked the start of the Teixeira family's worst days. Rui Pedro's tutor called to inform them that the boy hadn't attended his class. This was highly unusual since Rui Pedro had never missed a class before. Panic set in as his parents feared that an unexpected epileptic seizure might have rendered him unconscious, potentially causing severe brain damage if he didn't receive prompt attention. The news quickly spread throughout the village, and concerned residents sprang into action. They organized small search teams to cover the entire town. Soon, they found their first clue. A neighbor reported that around 3 p.m., he had spotted Rui Pedro's bicycle hidden among the bushes near the soccer field where he had been playing. Manuel and Filomena knew their son very well. They understood that his bicycle meant the world to him, and he wouldn't just leave it behind without a good reason. This led them to believe that Rui Pedro might have been taken against his will. Without hesitation, they rushed to the police station to report his disappearance. Upon receiving the report, the police launched their investigation by questioning the 3 boys who had been playing soccer with Rui Pedro. These friends recounted how a black car had entered the field to pick up their friend, identifying Afonso as the driver. They emphasized that Afonso's behavior had been strange and controlling toward their young companion. Initially, the officers doubted the children's accounts and chose to disregard their statements. However, they mentioned the misleading lead to the mother, which raised her suspicions. Filomena then mentioned Rui Pedro's request from that same afternoon to meet up with his friend. Immediately, everyone's attention turned to the truck driver, and the authorities proceeded to search his home. Afonso welcomed the officers who wanted to ask him some routine questions. As the last person who had seen the child, his statement could provide crucial information. However, the truck driver remained unusually calm and claimed not to have seen Rui Pedro. His reaction raised suspicion among the agents, given the numerous testimonies they had collected. Consequently, he was taken to the police station for further questioning. Once at the precinct, Afonso attempted to offer an excuse. He mentioned that his brother had asked him to take the car for its annual inspection, a mandatory requirement in Portugal for vehicles over 8 years old. However, records showed that he had never attended the scheduled appointment for that afternoon. Afonso persisted with his story, continuing to deny that the child had gotten into the car hours earlier. He admitted to a brief encounter of only 5 minutes with Rui Pedro before 2 p.m. Afterward, he claimed to have driven to a nearby town, which was about 15 kilometers from Lausada, and parked in front of a pharmacy. Afonso asserted that he stayed in the car for a while before deciding to take a stroll through the city, even mentioning that he admired the shop windows. When he grew tired, he drove to his girlfriend's house, arriving at 6:45 p.m. The woman lived in another village in the region, just 11 minutes away from Lausada. Meanwhile, at the police station reception, Rui Pedro's grandfather and cousin anxiously waited, determined to apply pressure to expedite the investigations. When Afonso's interrogation concluded, the two of them crossed paths with the suspect in the hallways. Upon seeing him, the grandfather desperately inquired about his grandson's whereabouts and offered anything in exchange for an answer. Afonso broke down in tears and insisted that he didn't know where the child was, but he warned that if they wanted to find him, it was essential to close all borders because he had probably been kidnapped and was on his way to a foreign country. The cousin also confronted Afonso and even mentioned a conversation they had with Rui Pedro the day before. The man's only response was to shout at the boy to be quiet once and for all, but the cousin remained unfazed. On the contrary, he continued the narrative with more details. Afonso had offered to take both of them to meet prostitutes and said that the meeting point would be a vacant lot. Following these events, a large-scale police investigation was launched in the region, involving local residents, firefighters, and even the assistance of bloodhounds to find the trail of the lost child. The officers believed that the boy might have had a seizure and was unconscious somewhere in the village. Or maybe he had simply wandered far away and couldn't find his way back. In summary, they considered it a case of a search and rescue, ruling out the hypothesis of kidnapping. Rui Pedro's family was outraged by this approach to the case. Due to the extensive dissemination of Rui Pedro's images in the local media, a sex worker recognized his face and contacted the local police. She stated without hesitation that on March 4, 1998, a black car had stopped in front of her on a desolate road. The driver offered her $10 to have sex with the little boy who accompanied him. She asked how old the boy was, and the man replied that he was old enough. The woman took him behind some bushes by the side of the road and looked for a private place where no one could see them. There was no sexual contact. The little boy was very terrified, crying nonstop and repeating over and over again that he wanted to leave. Seeing the child in such a distraught state, the sex worker couldn't help but feel compassion for him. She spent around 15 minutes trying to comfort him. She hugged him tightly and assured him that everything would eventually be all right. Amidst his sobs, he confided in her that he had been forced to attend that meeting. After emerging from the bushes, the child got into the car, and that was the last time she saw him. All signs pointed to a kidnapping, but even with this compelling witness statement, the police still hesitated to fully embrace this theory. In a desperate plea, the family begged the authorities to act urgently, stressing that each passing moment could be critical to the child's survival. The following morning, just after the court's opening, Begg managed to persuade the public prosecutor's office to request the intervention of the Judicial Police, a specialized agency responsible for investigating serious crimes like homicides, kidnappings, organized crime, and terrorism. Within 24 hours of Rui Pedro's last sighting, several judicial police officers arrived in the town. In the subsequent days, alongside family members and neighbors, they meticulously combed through the entire region, suspecting that Rui Pedro might have been left somewhere. The distribution of posters featuring the child's photograph escalated, reaching a national level, and the entire country of Portugal was deeply shaken by the case. The disappearance of the child sparked an overwhelming sense of collective sorrow. People referred to Rui Pedro as our boy or our little Pedro. Simultaneously, the family began receiving a barrage of phone calls, many of which were tormenting and distressing. Some claimed to have Rui Pedro in their custody, while others provided leads to his whereabouts that ultimately led nowhere. The most audacious callers even demanded a ransom payment. One particular and terrifying call featured a child whose voice sounded eerily similar to Rui Pedro's. Amidst screams and tears, he desperately called out for his mother. Citing the challenge of tracing all communications, the police decided not to pursue any leads that came through phone calls. The family's desperation grew, and the omission of potentially valuable information for the ongoing investigation appeared both inept and negligent. In April 1998, 1 month after the disappearance, a suspicion emerged. A renowned Portuguese journalist traveled to Disneyland in Paris with his wife and children for a report intended to be published in a widely read magazine with national circulation in Portugal. The article featured a series of portraits of him and his family at various park attractions. Among these images, one particular photograph raised alarm bells. In the background, a small child could be seen with a man dressed in red. Filomena and Manuel saw the photograph and firmly asserted that it was Rui Pedro. In September of the same year, a significant breakthrough occurred as the British police dismantled a pedophile network in an operation known as Operation Cathedral. This organization primarily operated online and served as a database with thousands of photos and videos depicting sexually abused children. This operation gained high-profile attention due to the unusually large amount of pornographic content possessed, produced, and distributed by this organization's members. Shockingly, they discovered more than 750,000 photos and 1,800 videos. Out of the 1,263 individuals featured in the seized material, only 17 were identified. 1 from Argentina, 1 from Chile, 1 from Portugal, 6 from the UK, and 7 from the United States. Filomena confirmed that Rui Pedro appeared in some of those photos, confirming that he was still alive, but nothing more. There were no coordinates or leads to his possible location. The British police speculated that members of the network had abused him on camera and then potentially harmed him. Over the next 13 years, the Public Ministry of Portugal built a case against Afonso, who consistently maintained his innocence. The trial began in November 2011. The key testimonies came from Rui Pedro's 3 friends, forming the backbone of the case. While the judge could verify certain facts presented by the prosecution, the court dismissed several testimonies due to a lack of conclusive evidence. In March 2012, Afonso was acquitted. On Rui Pedro's 27th birthday, January 28, 2014, a video was published that quickly went viral on social media. Some actors voluntarily participated in this video campaign. Their aim was to search for new clues about Rui Pedro's whereabouts, while also including the email addresses of the Northern Board of Judicial Police and the Portuguese Association for Missing Children to ensure that the young man's case would not fade into obscurity. This campaign had a broader goal of denouncing child trafficking for sexual exploitation. Returning to the legal proceedings, Afonso's freedom was short-lived. After an appeal by Rui Pedro's family in 2014, a new ruling from the Porto Court of Appeals sentenced him to 3 years in prison. This sentence was for inciting a minor to engage in involuntary sexual relations, but it was not related to the kidnapping or any other charges linked to the disappearance itself. Despite Afonso's defense attorney filing an appeal, this second ruling was confirmed by the Portuguese Supreme Court. On October 3, 2014, the resolution was ratified, and on March 18, 2015, Afonso was taken into custody after the police issued an arrest warrant. He was released on parole in March 2017, having served only 2/3 of his sentence. Afonso continued to maintain his innocence, claiming to be the victim of a grave injustice. 20 years after the disappearance in 2019, Rui Pedro was officially declared presumed dead. The police concluded their search as no further leads had emerged since Operation Cathedral, and the case had gone cold. The young man's whereabouts remain a painful mystery. Despite the ceaseless pain and the enduring void of not knowing what happened to her son, Filomena did not give up. In 2007, she founded the Association of Relatives of Missing Children. Rui Pedro's case highlighted a grave issue. We are confronted with a deeply serious phenomenon. Every year, 3 million children are kidnapped worldwide. In Portugal alone, there are over 60 missing children and minors. Juan Fernando Hermosa Suarez came into the world on February 28, 1976, amidst the picturesque province of Sucumbios in Ecuador. His early life was shrouded in mystery, with no concrete information about his biological father and his mother, a humble laundry worker, struggling to provide for him. Consequently, when Juan was just a year old, destiny intervened, leading to his adoption by Rafael Hermosa and Zoila Suarez, a compassionate couple longing for children. They resided in a small and tranquil city in Ecuador until 1982, when a significant change transpired. Rafael sold their farm, and the family relocated to Quito, the vibrant capital of Ecuador. Initially, Juan's life appeared to follow a typical trajectory. He experienced the ups and downs of childhood, marked by occasional erratic moods. However, a pivotal moment occurred when he was around 7 years old. A young girl named Gloria entered the Hermosa family's life, altering its course. Gloria, at the tender age of 14, unveiled a startling revelation. She was Juan's sister. Gloria sought refuge with the Hermosa family, as her stepfather had cast her aside. Rafael and Zoila, known for their compassion, welcomed Gloria into their home. As time passed, Gloria found herself alone with Juan and chose to share a life-altering secret. Juan was adopted. This revelation, delivered without much consideration for his age and emotional readiness, left Juan grappling with profound questions. Gloria's presence also brought strife into the household, as she frequently disparaged Rafael and Zoila to Juan. Her tales included speculations about theft and flight from their home. Gloria's turbulent and disruptive behavior made it difficult for her to coexist with the Hermosa family, and she soon moved on. Juan's response to this revelation was tumultuous. As he mustered the courage to confront his adoptive parents, tears welled up in his eyes. He posed the painful question of whether it was true that Rafael and Zoila were not his biological parents. Faced with the heart-wrenching truth, they had no choice but to share the details of Juan's adoption. Some people have the notion that criminal behavior can be attributed solely to the influence of one's upbringing. In this case, Juan's adoptive parents, though imperfect, made sincere efforts to guide him down the right path. Nevertheless, it became increasingly evident that Juan's trajectory was far from conventional. Juan's journey took a tumultuous turn as he spiraled into rebellion. Crossing the boundary of typical childhood behavior at the tender age of 9. It was during these formative years that he began a disturbing pattern of animal cruelty, primarily targeting cats. He would macabrely bring their lifeless remains to school, seeking to shock and garner attention. Unsurprisingly, these actions resulted in multiple expulsions from school. In an attempt to curb his unruly behavior, Rafael, his adoptive father, resorted to occasional corporal punishment. Yet his discipline never escalated to a level that could be deemed excessive. In fact, it was evident that Juan did not hold any lingering grudges against Rafael or Zoila. his adoptive mother. Rafael's work commitments frequently led him to travel, leaving Juan with more unsupervised time. Although Zoila provided some company, her hearing impairment and struggles with arthritis prevented her from being a constant presence. Consequently, Juan found himself increasingly isolated. Completing elementary school at the age of 12 was a significant accomplishment for Juan, given his penchant for petty theft. He had already embarked on a path of pilfering, selling whatever items he could lay his hands on. Remarkably, his criminal endeavors thus far had entailed relatively low levels of risk. However, at the age of 13, Juan became embroiled in a reckless car theft escapade alongside older boys. Assuming the role of a passenger, they initially evaded capture. Their audacious greed, however, led them to steal yet another vehicle, resulting in their apprehension. Juan's subsequent placement in a juvenile correctional facility underscored the urgent need for reform within these institutions. In the majority of cases, these facilities only serve to further entrench delinquent behavior, treating these young individuals as hardened criminals. The meager mental assistance provided took the form of disconnected lectures, falling short of addressing their unique needs. Ultimately, these facilities inadvertently fostered camaraderie among these youths, often amplifying the influence of the already deeply troubled. Contrary to expectations, Juan found himself targeted within the correctional facility, not due to his physical stature or menacing appearance, but as a victim of severe bullying. Physical assaults and harsh verbal taunts became a daily ordeal. Amid this grim backdrop, a fellow inmate named Luis Aníbal, merely 2 months older than Juan, entered the scene. Sharing a background of financial hardship, Luis's mother worked as a cleaner, but he had not been placed for adoption. Luis's circumstances were even more dire, with an abusive stepfather, mistreatment of his mother, and his sister subjected to similar horrors. Luis Aníbal found himself on a perilous path marked by thefts and altercations, eventually leading him to the correctional facility. His presence there was not the consequence of a specific crime, but rather a desperate measure enacted by his mother, who hoped to redirect him onto the right track, only to inadvertently exacerbate his situation. Extended stays in the correctional facility, combined with shared experiences and a profound sense of disconnection from mainstream society, brought together these young men who struggled to forge connections elsewhere. In a bold endeavor, they even hired a taxi driver on an hourly basis to impart driving lessons. In no time, they became proficient behind the wheel of a car, coincidentally a taxi. The prospect of learning to drive infused these young men with excitement, for it heralded the initiation of their car theft endeavors. Their maiden foray into auto theft involved a Hyundai Accent, a venture that left no casualties, except for Juan and Aníbal themselves, who, presumably due to nerves, met with a road mishap. Providentially, their escapade went unnoticed, and they managed to elude capture. Their subsequent car theft also ended in an encounter with law enforcement. However, they had meticulously prepared for such an eventuality, carrying counterfeit credentials purporting them to be the offspring of officers stationed in Quito. It goes without saying that these claims were entirely fabricated, unbeknownst to the genuine officers. Fortuitously for the boys, they were intercepted by a sergeant and a corporal who were unacquainted with the officers they impersonated, hence readily accepting the spurious credentials. Inquisitive officers questioned the boys about the car, intuitively discerning that it was unusual for the child of an officer to possess such a vehicle. Displaying remarkable cunning, the boys explained that it was a stolen car their father had managed to recover. The officers, harboring suspicions, suggested changing the vehicle's tires. It's important to note that some may not be familiar with the prevalent practice in Latin America, where police recover stolen cars, strip them of valuable parts for resale, and subsequently lay blame on the thieves for causing damage to the vehicle. The boys consented, offering to replace any components with lower quality substitutes in exchange for monetary compensation. The officers agreed, and an arrangement that left all parties content ensued. This modus operandi persisted for a while, initially yielding limited results. While leaving a disco with friends on November 22, 1991, the Juan and his group took a taxi. Hermosa pulled out a pistol obtained through a guard, shooting the driver in the head and killing him instantly. One of his friends then drove the vehicle to the southeast of the city and disposed of the body in the Los Chios Valley, where the body was found by police the next day. A week later, Hermosa went with other members of his gang to a hairdresser where he usually fixed his hair, operated by a transgender named Charlie. Charlie invited them to drink at home, where they started an argument which ended in Hermosa shooting Charlie 5 times before he could ask for help. Hermosa's crimes totaled 22 murders, occurring in only 4 months, claiming the lives of 8 taxi drivers, 11 homosexuals, a truck driver and his acquaintance, as well as 2 others, earning him the nickname the Kid of Terror. The victims were shot to death with a pistol, the crimes occurring during the weekends, which caused a panic among the taxi drivers and homosexuals who lived in northern Quito. One fateful morning, patrolling officers were alerted by what sounded like gunshots, prompting them to initiate the strategic sweep of the vicinity. Guided by the direction of the gunshots, they arrived on an almost deserted street, where a taxi was observed traversing the area. Reacting swiftly, the officers accelerated, overtaking the taxi and discerning the presence of several minors inside. Recognizing that the police were in pursuit, the young individuals accelerated, yet the officers were undeterred, maintaining their vigilance. And when they realized that escaping in the taxi wasn't going to be possible, they stopped and opened all 4 doors to run in opposite directions. They were only able to capture one suspect, and that was Luis Aníbal. Luis was taken to the police station, and they began questioning him to get a confession, but he didn't utter a single word. Days passed, along with threats because the taxi he fled from belonged to a man who had been murdered a few hours earlier. Still, Luis remained silent until a group of boys came to visit him to see what was going on with him. This seemed odd to the police because they had kept this capture hidden, and only a few relatives knew that Luis was there. These boys, seeing that Luis couldn't get out, left the place. But the officers, seeing that the presumed suspects were minors, and their profile matched perfectly, assigned an undercover officer to see what their next moves would be. Throughout the day, the detective saw that these boys seemed to spend the whole day together, hanging out in the streets. In the evening, they entered a nightclub, and more agents were called to see if they would take the bait that was about to be set. In the early morning, when the boys left the nightclub, a taxi passed nearby, and they stopped it. Several agents were already following the taxi, and indeed, these boys had the intention of assaulting the taxi driver, but he was also an agent, and practically the whole gang of terror was captured. But their leader, Juan, had not been with them. Under pressure, the boys confessed, but they claimed they were not responsible for the murders and that Juan Carlos was the culprit. Juan Carlos was the name Juan Fernando used to have a different identity as a criminal and protect his real identity. In contrast, Luis used the alias Santiago. The police began to investigate Juan Fernando Hermosa and found his address. At that time, Juan lived with Zoila, and Rafael was not at home. On January 14, 1992, in the early morning, several officers began to surround Juan's house and entered through a skylight. Juan realized this, grabbed his gun, and a shootout ensued. Unfortunately, since he was sleeping in the same bed with his mother, and she may not have heard due to her deafness, she stayed in bed. In the exchange of fire, Zoila was hit by 19 bullets, leading to her death. Juan attempted to escape, threw a grenade at the police, and when he was climbing out of a window to escape, he was captured. Subsequently, following Juan's grenade launch, testimonies surfaced from both Juan and the neighbors, attesting that it was, In fact, the police who had lobbed the grenade. Countless enigmas envelop the circumstances leading to Zoila's tragic fate. It raises questions about why she was swiftly transported away in an ambulance when it was patently evident that she had already departed from this world. Standard procedure dictates that when someone is unmistakably deceased, they should remain at the scene for forensic evaluation. Upon his arrival at the police precinct, Juan unambiguously declared, as I quote, "I want to clarify that my name is Juan Fernando Hermosa Suarez, and on February 28th, I will celebrate my 16th birthday." This stratagem was employed to exploit legal provisions, given his status as a minor, and it elicited an explosion of media coverage. Juan ascended to a newfound level of notoriety, capturing the headlines in every newspaper. On numerous occasions, he participated in interviews for which he received compensation. Juan took all the blame for himself and wanted to leave his companions out of it. However, seeing that he also didn't want to receive many years in prison, he began to create excuses, claiming that a supposed general, who does exist, had hired him to commit all these crimes because of the death of his daughter, which was attributed to a supposed taxi driver. This was taken seriously because the other kids also started saying the same thing. The authorities were so stirred by this that they seriously began to investigate the general. They asked these kids about how he looked, and they said he was of average height and had prominent hair, but that wasn't accurate. He was tall and always had a military haircut. It also makes perfect sense that a general with all the connections in the world would hire a 15-year-old kid like Juan, who was a complete stranger. The authorities dismissed the accusations, and Juan began to make more excuses. Now he claimed that the taxi drivers were responsible for their own deaths. Clearly, he was still a child. He insisted that the last thing he wanted was to kill. He stated, "I asked them to stay still, that nothing would happen to them. But that didn't happen. Once again, I was threatened with a revolver, so I used my weapon. And a taxi driver tried to hit me with a lug wrench, so I was also forced to shoot." But even if that were true, this excuse wouldn't hold up because he had murdered 22 people by that point. There was no way he could be saved because he was young. It's not like he was suddenly going to turn his life around, and Juan confirmed this. At the time of his trial, Juan was already 16 years old and was sentenced to just 4 years at an orientation center because that was the maximum penalty for a minor in Ecuador. Juan underwent several psychological exams, which mostly described him as an organized psychopath. This type of psychopath tends to be natural leaders, and it was within 16 months of being in that center that Juan formed a gang and devised a plan to escape. He had a girl who had accompanied him in a previous taxi robbery arranged to meet him on the day of his visits. They had agreed that she would deliver a pistol to him so he could escape. In a juvenile center, the security wasn't as high, and Juan knew that at some point there would only be one guard watching the exit. When this happened, he seized the opportunity and shot the sole remaining guard with 5 shots, causing his death. Immediately, Juan and 10 other young people managed to escape from there. The news once again exploded, and somehow, Juan quickly managed to escape to Colombia, reaching Bogota. He began to live off the sale of stolen jewelry, but being in a new country where he was also being pursued, he couldn't steal as easily as he could in Ecuador. So shortly after, he was found, and tired of going hungry, he told the police, "Yes, I am Juan Fernando Hermosa," and he was sent back to Ecuador. He was temporarily placed in a high-security cell, but was soon returned to the same orientation center from which he had escaped before. However, this time, he didn't escape again. He didn't even serve the initial 4-year sentence they had given him, despite having killed a guard and escaped to Colombia. Many couldn't believe it, but in January 1996, Juan was already free. And this obviously caused a lot of resentment in many people who saw the judicial system as a failure. Juan returned to his childhood town, where he began to live with Rafael. In the early days, Juan seemed enthusiastic about finding a job, but no one wanted to hire him until Rafael contacted a friend who could give Juan a job in a bus collecting money. He started working and gradually began to enjoy the nightlife again, although it is assumed that he only went out to party and consume alcohol. On February 26, 1996, Juan had gone out with some friends to a bar around 10 p.m. At 12, the bar owner asked him to leave because the more the other customers consumed alcohol, the more they expressed their disgust for Juan, as his face and what he had done were known throughout the country. He had no choice but to board a bus and leave. 2 days later, Rafael received a call from the police, informing him that they had found what appeared to be his son's body near a river. The body was unrecognizable, not due to decomposition, but because it had been beaten, tortured, and assaulted in every possible way, even run over by a car, with his hands tied with wire. He was only identified as Juan because he had his identification in his pockets, and next to the body, they had left a newspaper clipping that said, "The Hermosa Syndrome throughout the country." The body was found on the same day that Juan was supposed to turn 20. Some say that the perpetrators were contacts of the officers he had deals with, but it could have been anyone because this young man had made enemies from all sides. On the morning of July 18, 2019, thousands of Japanese people in the city of Kyoto were surprised in the middle of their usual morning activities by a very unusual event. That morning, out of nowhere, the entire city could hear the sound of multiple ambulances and fire trucks racing through Kyoto with their sirens blaring, startling the entire population. Most Japanese who witnessed the massive mobilization of ambulances and patrols couldn't help but wonder what could be the cause of this, while simultaneously thinking that whatever it was, it had to be something serious because all these vehicles seemed to be heading to the same location, disregarding the usual heavy traffic in Kyoto mid-morning, causing all cars and bicycles on the road to give way to the authorities. By 11 a.m. on this summer morning, it became apparent to the population that indeed, all this professional equipment was heading to the same building. Emergency services had received multiple calls reporting an explosion heard around 10:30 in the morning, and the worst part was that the building was reported to be engulfed in flames. As the fire quickly spread throughout the first floor, most of the people inside couldn't escape the flames. This place was an office complex belonging to the company Kyoto Animation, an animation studio founded in 1981 that had produced various anime and manga novels of all kinds. Throughout its history, it has released great works that have captivated both Japanese and international audiences due to its high production standards. Alerted by the calls they had received, which evidenced the severity of the situation, the emergency services instructed all available personnel to arrive at the scene as quickly as possible. When they arrived at the building, the situation looked much worse than expected. Several neighbors who lived nearby were observing the scene from what they thought was a safe distance while they waited for the firefighters and paramedics. The scene of the fire was, to put it mildly, disheartening. The flames enveloped the entire building and leaped out of the windows, creating long tongues of fire that immediately hindered the efforts of the firefighters trying to contain the fire and rescue those who were still trapped inside what had become a deadly concrete trap. The police officers began to instruct the neighbors to move further away from the scene, as in many cases of fires and explosions, there was a significant possibility that the building could collapse. According to reports at the time, there were 73 company employees working there at the moment of the fire. From the moment they set foot on the street, the paramedics knew they had a lot of work to do because even the employees who had managed to escape the offices were now at the foot of the burning building, seriously injured, some unable to move or unconscious. Most of them had suffered terrible injuries and cuts while trying to exit the building. The most terrible part was that most of them had severe third-degree burns. These are classified as such because they affect the deepest layers of the skin and require immediate medical attention, as they have a high risk of infection. Additionally, when a person has these burns in multiple parts of their body, or almost entirely, as was the case with some of these studio workers, the chances of losing their life are very high. For this reason, it was crucial that the workers receive timely treatment, so emergency doctors began to separate the injured according to the severity of their injuries in order to assist those who needed urgent medical help. This way, the most affected individuals began to be stabilized before being transported to the hospital by ambulance. At this point, the number of severely injured people was so high that more than 30 ambulances had to be mobilized in total to transport the victims of the supposed accident. It's important to clarify that the authorities believed before arriving at the scene that this was an accidental fire. However, what was happening just a block away from the scene would give a very drastic twist to this story. Just 100 meters from the burning building, some police officers from a nearby train station were detaining a man who had been chased there by Kyoto Animation employees. The man had serious burns on his face and various parts of his body. This raised several questions because why would the authorities subdue a man who appeared to be a victim of the fire? In addition to all this, multiple witnesses were reporting to the police officers present at the scene that they had seen a man enter the animation studio around 10:30 that morning with what appeared to be bottles of gasoline. So with this and the testimonies of the survivors of the tragedy who were conscious, the authorities understood that this was an arson attack and therefore a mass murder. When the firefighters were able to control the fire enough to enter the building and analyze the scene, they observed that the death toll of this tragedy had risen to 34 people. Shortly after, it would increase to 36, as 2 of the injured, suffering from the effects of their burns, could not endure any longer and lost their lives. The man was arrested, as the same employees who had pursued him claimed that he was responsible, and the same police officers who had arrested him during his transfer to the hospital testified that this man began shouting that yes, he was the one who had caused the fire at Kyoto Animation, justifying it by saying that everyone inside deserved to die because they had stolen his work without giving him any recognition. Once at the hospital, the first thing known was that the suspect's name was Shinji Alba, and he was 41 years old. He had many injuries covering his entire body from the fire he allegedly caused. Once his wounds had healed enough for him to be kept in a cell without dying from an infection, a lengthy interrogation awaited him so that the entire country and the world would have an idea of what motivated him to commit such a horrible crime. Not much is known about this man's childhood, as his parents were born in a small village. Shinji's maternal grandfather was an honorable man who had taken on 2 jobs simultaneously to support his family. He mainly worked transporting goods by cart to Tokyo. He was considered a very kind and hardworking man until one day he was diagnosed with advanced cancer and, unable to afford the treatment that would save him, he made the decision to take his own life to avoid burdening his family with the responsibility of helping him. Shinji's mother would meet the man who would become the father of her children during her adolescence. The problem arose because this man was almost 17 years older than her when they met, and it was known that he was married at the time. As a result, the woman's family strongly disapproved of their relationship, which is a very serious matter in Japan, as Japanese society places a significant emphasis on appearances. However, against all odds, she escaped from her parents' home, never to return. After running away, she started working in a factory near Kyoto, and eventually she got married with the older man. The couple had 3 children, of whom there is only information available about Shinji and his sister. After leading what seemed to be a relatively normal life, it appears that Shinji's mother wanted some excitement and began an affair with a much younger man than her husband. When she was caught, she left home, leaving her husband, who earned a living as a taxi driver, completely alone and responsible for their 3 children. This continued to be the family's normal life until 1999, when a car accident left the father paralyzed. He was subsequently fired from the taxi company where he worked, leaving the man, who was already struggling to make ends meet, without the possibility of working to pay rent and provide food for his 3 children. Faced with this overwhelming pressure and distress, the man made the tragic decision to end it all. Despite all this, up to a certain point, Shinji had led a relatively normal life in his youth. Nothing out of the ordinary happened during his high school years, and he even worked part-time as a document clerk for the government. After graduating, Shinji continued to work part-time at a supermarket, and when he reached his 20s, he decided to move to another city. Everything seemed to be going relatively well until his mother's disappearance and his father's death, which slowly caused his life to crumble. The young man increasingly lacked motivation to move forward, and just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, life dealt him another blow. Shinji's sister, about whom little information is available, was almost at the point of losing hope. On that day, this woman visited a temple in the city, where she started talking to a priest about all the pain she had suffered in recent years. She then prayed for the repose of her father's soul before leaving the temple without saying a word. The next day after this visit, her lifeless body was found in a hostel near the temple she had visited, and she was determined to be the cause of her own tragic ending. After his sister's death, Shinji's life began to spiral downhill. His mental and economic problems led him to commit a robbery in 2012, where he managed to escape with around 20,000 yen in his bag. However, he was arrested shortly afterward and subsequently sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Upon his release, Shinji became a complete social outcast. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. He had no family or friends, and he struggled to maintain any relationships due to his violent temper. This isolation led him to withdraw completely into his apartment. Like a significant portion of the Japanese population, Shinji loved manga and anime. Since childhood, he had dreamt of becoming a manga writer. Faced with a bleak future and difficulties finding employment, Shinji decided to pursue his dream. He began writing light novels and drawing manga panels. At this point, Shinji's story intersects with that of Kyoto Animation, a company with an excellent reputation not only in Japan, but also internationally. Kyoto Animation's specialty is depicting the wonders and dilemmas of everyday life. In other words, they create works with characters that look childlike or relatable, making it easy for viewers to connect with them quickly. However, they often incorporate plot twists that can leave you in tears. Every year, this animation company holds a manga and novel writing contest, where enthusiasts submit their works in the hopes of getting them published or adapted by the studio, or even turned into a big screen production. In 2018, Shinji submitted one of his novels for the contest, following all the specified steps. However, despite constantly checking his email for responses, he received no reply from the animation studio. As the days passed, 40-year-old Shinji felt that his hope of becoming a successful manga writer was slipping through his fingers. Several months later, on one of those afternoons when all Shinji did was watch anime and play video games, he started watching an anime produced by Kyoto Animation. The show told the story of high school students who were involved in long-distance shooting sports. That very afternoon, Shinji felt humiliated because he realized that his idea had been stolen. Yes, you heard it right. A giant studio worth millions of dollars had allegedly stolen his story without giving him the slightest credit. Maybe they didn't steal his entire manga idea, but they had apparently lifted a scene directly from his work. Shinji was outraged because he believed that in the submission he had sent to Kyoto Animation, there was a rather inconsequential scene in which the anime's protagonists were in a supermarket buying discounted meat. According to him, this scene was identical to one in an episode of the show that had aired that week. The scene was quite generic and nothing out of the ordinary. However, likely due to his unstable mental state and isolation, Shinji couldn't stop obsessing over the idea that his idea had been stolen. He was filled with anger, wondering how they could have not even bothered to respond to his contest submission and had apparently taken advantage of his creativity without giving him the slightest credit. In reality, according to the studio, Shinji's novel submission had not passed the first elimination round conducted by the contest judges, which was why they hadn't bothered to contact him. Nevertheless, from the very beginning, Shinji demonstrated that he wasn't mentally well and acted on the belief that he had been personally attacked and blatantly robbed. All of this brings us to July 14, 2019, 4 days before the fire. 9 months earlier, Shinji had sent anonymous threats to Kyoto Animation, threatening them with death. Over 200 emails had been sent, and although employees had reported this to the police, nothing could be done because the emails were encrypted, and Shinji had waited for them to let their guard down. On that Sunday, a neighbor heard Shinji starting to hit the shared wall between their apartments. These two lived in apartments where every sound from the other side could be heard. Shinji, among them, used to be the noisiest, and they would occasionally bang on the walls to request silence from one another. However, this time, it turned out that the neighbor from the apartment above was moving, and consequently, they were the cause of the noise. The neighbor went to knock on Shinji's door, intending to explain that he wasn't the one making the noise, and to please stop banging on the wall. Before he had a chance to speak, Shinji angrily opened the door, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and yelled at him, "You're making too much noise. Shut up, or I'll kill you." Faced with this aggression, all of the neighbor's feelings turned to horror. From Shinji's demeanor, it was evident that he was perfectly capable of carrying out his threat. Without hesitation, he left the scene and called the police to report the assault. However, when the officers arrived at Shinji's apartment, he was already gone. It seems that this incident was the spark that would lead Shinji to commit his final act. The next day, Shinji took a bullet train to travel to Tokyo. He stayed in a hotel, and then, on Tuesday, headed to Kyoto, his final destination, where he stayed in another hotel. Several security cameras captured him in the areas near the animation studio. Several neighbors also remembered him clearly after the incident because Shinji wore the same red t-shirt and light jeans for all 4 days. Shinji spent several hours walking until he stopped at a store and bought a shopping cart. He then proceeded to a gas station where he bought 10 gallons of gasoline. With these supplies, Shinji stashed the cart and went to sleep, ready to carry out his evil plan early the next morning. On July 18, 2019, Shinji returned to the animation studio building around 10:30 in the morning, carrying his containers filled with gasoline. Upon entering, he blocked the 12 emergency exits and began to douse the studio with gasoline, taking advantage of the building's limited security, as such incidents are quite rare in Japan. Once everything was ready, Shinji struck a match, and everything started to burn. When the first people realized there was a fire, they attempted to escape through the emergency exits, but they were blocked. They ran towards the central exit where Shinji was present, still holding a gasoline container, and he began to douse the employees trying to escape while saying the word "die." This caused many people to run out into the street engulfed in flames. In just a moment, smoke had already reached the second floor of the building, and for those inside, it was too late to evacuate without suffering injuries. The building was completely engulfed in smoke in less than 2 minutes, making it difficult to breathe, and gradually, the animation studio workers began to lose consciousness due to the lack of oxygen. Most of the company's employees were on the top floor because the attack occurred during a meeting with executives from another company. It's unclear if Shinji planned this to claim more victims, but unfortunately, that day there were more people in the building than usual. To make matters worse, shortly after, an explosion rocked the building, causing the flames to burst through the windows and doors of the studio. The police believe that the combination of air and flames led to the explosion. As the fire grew, people inside the building tried to escape the flames. The majority of the victims, specifically 19 of them, were found on the third floor near the stairs leading to the emergency exit on the roof. These individuals unknowingly ended up on this staircase, which acted like an oven. After causing this hellish scene, Shinji accidentally set himself on fire with the same gasoline he had used to try to burn his victims. This led him to flee the scene, but an employee of Kyoto Animation did not accept this and started to chase him. Eventually, they all ended up at a train station located 100 meters from where Shinji was finally apprehended by 2 police officers from the same station. The fire was completely extinguished after 5 hours of immense efforts by the police and firefighters. It was at this point that the authorities were able to accurately count the victims of the incident. In this attack, 36 people lost their lives, while another 34 were left with serious injuries. Of the deceased, 28 died from carbon monoxide poisoning, 6 succumbed to their burns, and 2 passed away while receiving medical treatment at the hospital. It was reported that 2/3 of the fatal victims who worked at the studio were women, as Kyoto Animation was known for hiring women in almost all of its animation positions. After spending 10 months in the hospital, Shinji was officially arrested and processed. There were concerns about his physical health, and questions arose as to whether he would be physically capable of enduring the lengthy trial schedule ahead of him. His hospital treatment had taken so long because he had suffered burns on 90% of his body. In such cases, skin donors are crucial, but the Japanese authorities correctly prioritized obtaining donors for the victims. As for Shinji, he had no other option but to accept artificial skin, becoming the first person to undergo such a significant surgery of this kind without using real skin transplants. The judicial processes in Japan are known to be slow, as they usually involve multiple stages before a clear conviction is obtained. Since the trials for Shinji began, he underwent numerous psychiatric and psychological evaluations to determine if he was mentally healthy at the time of the crime. The results were somewhat mixed because, on one hand, it was clear that Shinji's brain did not function normally, but on the other hand, he was aware of what he was doing, making it difficult to predict what sentence he would receive. The decision had to be something between the death penalty and life imprisonment. The world was deeply affected by this crime, especially the animation industry. After the fire, an American anime licensor launched a successful GoFundMe campaign with a goal of $750,000 to assist the studio and the victims' families. In less than 24 hours, they raised over $1 million for this purpose. Even the then Prime Minister of Japan expressed condolences to the families, a figure many may recognize as he was assassinated a couple of years later. The president of Kyoto Animation mentioned that he did not plan to rebuild the studio in the same location, as it would be traumatic and bring bad memories for the employees. Instead, he considered demolishing the remains of the studio to create a park with a monument dedicated to the staff and the local community. Today, most of Kyoto Animation's employees have returned to work, this time in the company's second studio. One of these employees is a veteran manga artist who has been working at Kyoto Animation since the 1980s. He returned to work after the incident, having recovered from the injuries he sustained. He mentioned that he feels better when he is working than resting. He also expressed his intention to make his future work a tribute to those who perished. Another significant detail worth mentioning is that as a result of this tragedy, Japan decided to implement a new law. It requires citizens to present identification and provide reasons for their gasoline purchases when buying it in lighters or containers. Nibaldo Villegas worked as a computers teacher in the Valparaiso region of Chile. Everyone who knew him said he was a kind man who loved to help. He had many friends, both within and outside his work environment, and enjoyed socializing, often meeting up with relatives and friends. However, he never neglected his job. In 2009, when Nibaldo was 41, he met Johanna Hernandez, a 23-year-old woman studying at the same university where he taught. Johanna was going through a tough time, having just ended a relationship with her boyfriend since she was 15, with whom she had 2 children. Nibaldo was like a beacon of light for her. In December of that year, they started a relationship, and both their lives improved. Nibaldo and his family welcomed Johanna's children as if they were their own. After getting married, Nibaldo built a house with his own hands for them to live together and be happy. Their greatest joy came when Johanna gave birth to a daughter, their first child together. For 8 years, the relationship faced no major problems, and Nibaldo's professional life continued to prosper. Motivated by him, Johanna continued her nursing technician studies. When they did argue, Nibaldo preferred to go running, and upon returning, after both had time to reflect, they would talk in their bedroom and resolve their differences. But good things don't last forever. In 2018, their arguments became constant. Johanna started reacting differently to problems, becoming physically and emotionally violent. Nibaldo tried his usual approach of walking away and returning when she was ready to talk. But Johanna had changed. Her mood would shift rapidly, leaving Nibaldo with no time to leave. Things escalated to the point where Johanna, during an argument, started throwing things around and declared the relationship over. Nibaldo agreed to end the relationship but was concerned about her reactions. He went to the police station and filed a domestic violence report, fearing for his daughter's safety. Although the police dismissed the complaint, Johanna took it seriously, and a big dispute ensued over the house and custody of their daughter. Due to Johanna's violent outbursts, Nibaldo sought full custody. The family completely broke down, stopped living together, and Nibaldo filed for divorce, only seeing each other through lawyers. Eventually, the courts ruled for shared custody, which Johanna did not accept well. She began harassing Nibaldo, demanding the house he had painstakingly built. On one occasion, she showed up at the university parking lot and threw stones at his car. Nibaldo maintained his composure, not wanting to worsen the situation or make his daughter uncomfortable, and eagerly awaited the finalization of their divorce for a change. August 10, 2018, was an important date for Nibaldo, his 50th birthday. He spent most of the day with his daughter, but went to his parents' house in the evening. He left his daughter with them, as he was dining with friends and promised to return soon to put her to bed. The grandparents were happy to take care of her and spent quality time with her for several hours. However, when bedtime came, Nibaldo didn't show up. They tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail, which was unusual for Nibaldo, who was always attentive when his daughter wasn't with him. They decided to go to their son's house. On arrival, they noticed something suspicious. Nibaldo's car was parked in front. They entered the house and saw the house keys on a table, along with the jacket their son had been wearing when he left his daughter before dinner. However, what struck them most was a shattered glass on the floor. They hurried upstairs to Nibaldo's bedroom, fearing what they suspected. Their son was nowhere to be found, and their alarm grew. That same night, Nibaldo's parents went to the police station to file a missing person report. The search operation began immediately, involving friends, university acquaintances, and even neighbors, but no one knew where Nibaldo was. When Johanna was interrogated, she stated they hadn't seen each other for a long time due to their separation and appeared extremely distressed about his disappearance. Days later, Johanna showed up at Nibaldo's house, which his brother was staying at, carrying a large bag. She declared she would stay as long as she wanted, claiming it was her house too since they were still legally married. This seemed odd to the brother, knowing the couple had ended on very bad terms. To the Villegas family's surprise, Johanna became increasingly involved in the search for Nibaldo, posting on Facebook and giving interviews where she tearfully pleaded for her estranged partner's return. For 5 days, the country was gripped by the search for the missing teacher, until a boat brought an answer. On August 15 of that year, workers at the pier near Valparaiso, while performing their duties, spotted something alarming in the water. A human torso without limbs was floating in the calm sea. They immediately alerted the police. Once the authorities and forensic experts arrived, they determined it was a man between 30 and 50 years old. While they couldn't establish the identity yet, everyone thought the same. It had to be the missing professor, whose face had been all over the television for the past 5 days. On August 20, the prosecution and homicide brigade of the investigative police confirmed that the torso belonged to none other than Nibaldo. The discovery made a strong statement. Nibaldo was a peaceful man, got along with everyone, and had never been involved in anything illegal. The perpetrator had to be someone from his close circle. As detectives began their investigation, Johanna was the first of Nibaldo's relatives to give a television interview, again crying inconsolably, urging the capture of the culprit. Unbeknownst to her, she was exposing herself. On the day the body was found, 2 men went to the police station, wanting to speak to detectives about what they had seen on the day Nibaldo disappeared. On the early morning of August 11, the 2 individuals headed to the beach, intending to go on a fishing trip. Although unfamiliar with the area, they were excited about the expedition. However, their enthusiasm waned when they got lost at sea in the dark. Just as they were losing hope, they saw distant orange flames. They approached the shore with their boat and noticed a bonfire. A man was trying to keep the flames alive, using branches, cloths, and other objects they couldn't identify. The fisherman approached to ask for directions, thinking he might be lost like them. They tried to engage in casual conversation, but the man barely responded, only telling them it wasn't a good area for fishing before turning his attention back to the fire. The fishermen found the situation odd, especially when they noticed a blue car parked a few meters from the bonfire, with a woman inside smoking frantically. The situation seemed highly suspicious, but with nowhere else to go, the fishermen decided to stay overnight for shelter from the cold. At dawn, the woman got out of the car and approached the man by the fire. They appeared unaware of the fisherman's presence, shared a kiss, and gave one last look at the bonfire before driving away without a word. Before leaving, the fisherman took a closer look at the fire and noticed a sharp knife among the flames. Although it seemed strange, they preferred not to investigate further. They didn't think about that night again, until days later when a human torso was found floating near where they had been, realizing they had accidentally witnessed a terrible crime. After hearing the fisherman's story, the police went to the beach. It was a secluded area, so the remains of the bonfire were still there. They discovered that the mysterious man wasn't just burning branches and cloths, but also human remains. Forensic experts confirmed these were the remaining limbs of Nibaldo. But the fishermen provided another crucial piece of information. They described the woman smoking in the blue car as dark-haired, with long, straight hair of a darker complexion and around 30 years old. The same woman seen crying on television. From that moment, the police began investigating Johanna as the primary suspect in Nibaldo's murder. The only question was the identity of the man with her. Days later, the police discovered that Nibaldo's credit card had been used to withdraw 35,000 pesos from an ATM at a gas station on the morning of August 11. Security cameras showed a man in black making the transaction. The victim's family recognized him as Johanna's current partner, Francisco Silva. Additionally, shortly after the body's identification, Johanna went to a real estate agency to inquire about the property registered to Nibaldo, which they had fought over countless times, and where she had moved after his disappearance. There was no doubt that both Johanna and Silva were guilty of the crime. Both suspects gave their testimony at the oral criminal court. They admitted to being part of the crime, but blamed each other for its execution. Johanna was the first to give her version. She said her relationship with Silva was extremely complicated. Since they started dating, he had been manipulative, controlling what she wore, who she associated with, and even encouraged her to sign a prenuptial agreement. Silva's violence was not only reflected in his relationship with Johanna, but also in his strong feelings towards Nibaldo, seemingly driven by jealousy. After Nibaldo tried to gain full custody of the daughter he shared with Johanna, she came home crying. This intensified Silva's hatred, who said he would make Nibaldo disappear someday. The week before, on August 10, 2018, Silva arrived at Johanna's house with a jar containing a blue powder, instructing her not to ask questions and indicating he would have orders for her during the week. Accustomed to obeying Silva, Johanna agreed. On the Friday of Nibaldo's birthday, Francisco Silva contacted Johanna, instructing her to meet him to celebrate, and detailed the steps to follow. That night, Johanna arrived at the house of Nibaldo. He greeted her, hoping for reconciliation. Johanna brought sushi and a drink for dinner, but she omitted a crucial detail. The drink was laced with clonazepam. 10 minutes after sitting down to eat, Nibaldo began to doze off. Once he was completely unconscious, Johanna took him to his bed, snapped 2 photos, and sent them to Silva, completing her part of the plan. Silva then entered the house, changed into black clothing, and headed to the room where Nibaldo was carrying a knife. Minutes later, he came downstairs and informed Johanna that he had mutilated Nibaldo. He gave her gloves to clean the blood in the room and a trash bag for the limbs. While disposing of the body, Silva ominously warned Johanna that no matter what happened, she must not accuse him, or he would ensure she was seen as the true perpetrator. They then drove to the beach, where they'd burned the limbs and clothing in a bonfire, and tossed the torso into the sea. However, Silva's version was somewhat different. He not only denied Johanna's accusations, but also portrayed her as a violent person, prone to destructive outbursts when angry. According to him, Johanna used her tantrums and intimacy to manipulate him. He mentioned the prenuptial contract as a joke, inside gag after watching the movie 50 Shades, which she exploited to her advantage. The worst crisis came when Nibaldo wanted full custody of their daughter. Johanna swore she'd never forgive him and was ready to murder him. Seeing how upset Johanna was, Silva felt it was his duty as a man to do something about it and decided to do whatever she asked. Days later, Johanna requested he buy 30 clonazepam pills and grind them, which he did. The main difference in Silva's story was that on Friday, August 10, they were to follow their usual routine of having a barbecue, drinking, and sleeping in his car at the beach. However, when he picked Johanna up from her mother's house, he learned she had a different plan. She said they needed to stop by Nibaldo's to discuss their daughter. Once there, Johanna asked Silva to wait at a nearby place and wait for her instructions. He agreed. At 1 a.m., Silva woke to 3 WhatsApp messages from Johanna, 2 photos of an unconscious Nibaldo in bed, and a third message asking him to come get her. Arriving at the house, Johanna was frantic, explaining she had drugged Nibaldo with clomazepam before attacking him with a knife. The problem was that while she was stabbing him, Nibaldo woke up, and his pleas could be heard from the bedroom. Johanna instructed Silva to finish the murder, handing him a sharp knife. Silva went upstairs and fatally stabbed Nibaldo in the thoracic area. Immediately after, Johanna asked Silva to help her dismember the body to make it easier to hide. The rest of the story, involving the movement and concealment of different body parts, was exactly the same in both their accounts, seemingly the only aspect they both wanted to take responsibility for. The methods of the murder and the locations where the body parts were found matched in both stories. What differed was the principal perpetrator, as each one aimed to receive a lesser sentence. They also agreed in their statement that the murder was not premeditated. However, the prosecutors argued that the crime seemed meticulously planned, given how it was executed. Technology experts located both of their cell phones at Nibaldo's house at the time of his death, and both had photos of the unconscious man in bed, implicating Johanna and Silva equally in the eyes of justice. The prosecutor stated that Johanna was the material author of the crime. Francisco Silva was convicted as the material author of qualified homicide. Both had the aggravating factor of treachery, which occurs when the perpetrator uses means or ways to eliminate all the victim's possibilities of defense. In Nibaldo's case, the means was the substance that rendered him unconscious. On May 16, 2019, the criminal court informed the sentence for both defendants, receiving the maximum possible penalty. Johanna was sentenced to life imprisonment, meaning she must serve 40 years before being eligible for penitentiary benefits. Silva was sentenced to simple life imprisonment, meaning he could opt for penitentiary benefits after 20 years. Johanna's defense requested a reclassification of the sentence, arguing she had collaborated with the investigation. They also sought to annul the aggravating factor of treachery, claiming there was no proof of clomazepam administration. Silva's lawyer also tried to reduce the sentence by claiming active participation in the investigation. Fortunately for the victim's family, both requests were denied. About 100 people gathered outside the court, celebrating with intense banners, but while citizens unrelated to the crime celebrated, the families involved in the case were left shattered. The Villegas family's lawyer stated that while they were satisfied with the sentence, Nibaldo's siblings would seek an update in the law, advocating for harsher penalties in dismemberment cases. Without the complete body of the victim, they couldn't give a dignified burial. Johanna's father also spoke about the crime, saying she had always been manipulative and violent, but worsened after meeting Francisco Silva. He agreed with her sentence and said he would never forgive her. In other interviews, he recalled Nibaldo's good character and expressed that he would always consider him part of the family, often visiting his grave with flowers. After the trial, Johanna and Silva were transferred to a penitentiary complex, where their troubles did not end. In prison, Johanna gained a high status for having ended her husband's life, instilling fear in most of the other inmates. Silva, on the other hand, was completely isolated, only going out to the yard when other inmates were not there. His situation only worsened over time. He went on a hunger strike for several days and wrote a letter to the National Human Rights Institute and the Court of Appeals, requesting a reduction in his sentence. When his plans did not work, Silva tried to contact Johanna, telling her he had spoken with a lawyer and was trying to reopen the case. His plan was for Johanna to claim she was the murderer so he would be seen as an accomplice. According to him, this would frame the crime as a momentary act of violence and might reduce their sentences for lack of premeditation. Johanna refused outright. Enraged, Francisco threatened her, claiming he had contacts who could harm her at any time. Eventually, Johanna filed a complaint for murder threats with the public ministry, which could play in her favor as it portrayed Silva as manipulative and conspiratorial, just as she had described him in her version of the events. As a result, the only measures taken against Silva were the confiscation of his cell phone and his transfer to a high-security cell. He was also barred from receiving family visits. While the murderers continue their lives in prison, Nibaldo's family is still fighting for him to rest in peace. They submitted a request to amend the penal code. The proposal, named Nibaldo's Law, aimed to add a clause to more rigorously penalize dismemberment or damage to a corpse, increasing the sentence for perpetrators by 3 to 5 years. If enacted, this law would not be retroactive and would not change the sentences for Nibaldo's murderers, but it would apply to future cases. The Villegas family might never be able to give Nibaldo a dignified burial, but they could prevent other families from suffering the same pain. In March 2022, the law was unanimously approved by the Senate and is currently being debated in the Chamber of Deputies. If it passes, it will only need the executive's approval to be officially promulgated. The Villegas siblings continue to carry this fight on their shoulders. Nothing will bring Nibaldo back, but they are doing everything possible to make the world a fairer place. Sydney Loofe was born on August 21, 1993, in a small Nebraska town called Broken Bow. In 2000, her family moved to the city of Nibaldo in search of other opportunities. From a young age, Sydney was known to be very good at fishing, which she loved. She also played volleyball and other sports at school, but unfortunately had to give them up due to developing scoliosis during her adolescence, a condition that affects the spine and causes an abnormal curvature to the sides, greatly increasing the risk of injuries during physical exertion. After finishing her high school studies in 2011, Sydney got a job at a hardware store and was able to move into a small apartment 3 hours away from her parents' home. According to her family, Sydney suffered from anxiety and had been struggling with severe depression. They were aware of this because just a few days before her disappearance, Sydney had opened up about it, leading her parents to help her get an appointment with a doctor and even taking her to the consultation to be prescribed antidepressants in hopes of improving her situation. Unfortunately, that day would be the last time her parents saw her alive. As the investigation progressed in search of useful information, the police contacted friends and acquaintances of the missing young woman for clues about her possible whereabouts. Thanks to a friend of Sydney, they learned that the girl had met a young woman named Audrey on the Tinder app, who had agreed to a date on November 14, 2017. For that date, Sydney had asked if it would just be the two of them, to which Audrey affirmatively replied. The date between the two women was to take place in the basement of an apartment that Audrey had rented. Strangely, it seemed to go well, as that night Sydney returned to her apartment, and they planned another date for the next day. There were several pieces of evidence for this, as Sydney had even posted a photo on her Snapchat on November 15 with the caption, "Ready for my date," along with a heart emoji. Until that moment, this was the only information the police had about Sydney. She had taken the precaution of informing her friends that she was going out with an unknown person from Tinder whom she had been talking to for some time. Among these friends was a girl named Brooklyn McChrystal, who, upon learning of Sydney's disappearance, set out to gather information about the person her friend had gone out with to hand over to the police. For this, she decided to create a Tinder account and began searching through profiles in the area until she finally found one of a girl, also named Audrey, like the person who had gone out with Sydney. Brooklyn proceeded to like this profile, and thus managed to make a match with this supposed Audrey. And they both started messaging until Brooklyn finally got Audrey to share her phone number. Once she had the number, Sydney's friend gave all the information to the police so they could start tracking the number and thus find the location of the suspect. This plan seemed unlikely to work, as many things could go wrong, but 2 days later, the authorities made a terrifying discovery. It turns out that when tracking Sydney's last phone movements before it lost signal, it was found in the same location as the phone number given by Sydney's friend. This left the officers no choice but to head to that location, leading them to the city of Wilbur, also in Nebraska, to a duplex apartment. On one side lived the owner, and on the other, a couple of tenants who immediately caught the officers' attention. The person renting the apartment was a 51-year-old man named Aubrey Trail, and his name was suspiciously similar to Audrey from Tinder, and the girl in these photos could perfectly be this man's girlfriend, a 23-year-old girl named Bailey Boswell. Despite all this, the police did not consider this couple as direct suspects, and for them, the possibility that Sydney was still alive was very high. For this reason, the visit they made to Aubrey and Bailey was routine and to leave no stone unturned. Upon arriving at the apartment and after knocking on the door several times, no one came out to greet them, so the officers asked the owner of the complex for help, who handed over the key, and they were able to confirm that there was no one at home. The only thing that caught the police's attention was that a penetrating smell of chlorine was coming out of this apartment, impregnating the entire place. The owner even told them that he had noticed this a day ago, and that because of that intense smell, a family member of the owner had vomited and developed a rash due to the potent chemical. He also mentioned that, strangely, he had noticed that Aubrey Trail and his girlfriend had the air conditioning still running despite it being November, and temperatures being very low in Nebraska at that time of the year. The next day, the police returned to the apartment, but this time they were more prepared and armed with a search warrant to enter and inspect the entire place thoroughly. However, they found nothing. Everything seemed the same as the day before. The couple was still without any signs of having returned home, and the same chlorine smell continued to emanate from the basement. But there was nothing else that caught their attention at first glance, so they left the place and focused on continuing to search for the missing young woman in the surroundings of the city. 2 weeks later, and still with no news of Sydney, her disappearance became more popular in the media, and in the absence of new evidence indicating another path to follow in the case, the police issued a public statement classifying Aubrey Trail and his girlfriend as persons of interest and possible suspects. In response to this statement, the man and his partner made a live broadcast on Facebook, defending themselves against the police accusations and claiming they were both innocent. At the end of the broadcast, it can even be heard Aubrey saying, "I pray for Sydney to appear soon." 2 days later, the police arrested Trail and Bailey in a hotel in Missouri. Although this was for charges not related to Sydney's case, it turns out that the two earned their living by scamming antique stores and private businesses. Defrauding people they also scammed. At the time of their arrest, according to police statements, the couple possessed maps, sleeping bags, and sports shoes, which appeared to be part of their tools for their plan to escape to Mexico. After this arrest for fraud, the police found an excuse to interrogate the two suspects about Sydney's case. At first, they did not say much, but Bailey confessed to being the owner of the Tinder profile identified as Audrey and confirmed that she had met with the girl on both occasions. According to her, the last time she saw Sydney was on November 15, after taking a ride in her own car while smoking marijuana, and then they left Sydney at a friend's house. After that, they did not exchange a single message. When the police asked where the friend's house was located, the young woman said she did not remember the exact location. She responded with monosyllables, and refused to give any personal information about herself. Aubrey Trail also refused to make any statements during his arrest for fraud and the subsequent interrogation. After this, the FBI decided to get involved in the investigation of Sydney's disappearance. Leah Boswell never had a father figure, as her father was absent when she was just a girl. Leah was good at sports, so much so that in high school, she was the first on the list of the fastest runners, and for this she was even once offered a scholarship to play basketball at the university. But all this promising future was ruined when she started having problems with substance abuse after graduation. Shortly after, she had a daughter and married a man named Freddie Pennell. Those who knew the dynamics of this couple describe it with terror, as this man was very aggressive, both physically and psychologically with Leah, and he had such an extreme drug addiction that, combined with his violent attitude, social service authorities were forced to take their daughter from their home when she was still in her early school years. According to Leah's mother, at one point, this man even hit and kicked her in the face while she was still pregnant. On the other hand, although it was hard to believe, Aubrey Trail had an even more complicated life than his partner. As a child, his parents were abusive to him in all possible ways, and Aubrey said he felt as if their greatest wish was for him to disappear. These mistreatments continued until his grandfather took over his upbringing. Sometime later, while still very young, Aubrey was forced to return to his childhood home, where he would again suffer abuse from his stepfather. Growing up in poverty, he had to move through various foster homes until, as a teenager, he ended up in prison after being convicted of armed robbery. On his release, he began looking for different ways to make a living, avoiding traditional employment. Scams became a part of Aubrey's daily life. He primarily defrauded antique shops by selling them fake objects purported to be ancient, and he also got involved in thefts whenever the opportunity arose, among other illegal activities. This was Aubrey's lifestyle, when one day while browsing a website, which was a classifieds page where implicitly many people sold their bodies, he contacted Leah Boswell. Aubrey was on this page looking to connect with a female, and Leah was supposedly there looking for a sugar daddy. This is how these two, with a 28-year age difference between them, began their relationship and moved in together to the apartment Aubrey had rented in the city of Wilbur. As the FBI gathered all this information about the suspects' past, while they remained under arrest for their fraud schemes, and during the interrogation process, neither was willing to provide additional information about the possible whereabouts of Sydney. They maintained their innocence regarding any crime related to her, but this would change when a very chilling discovery was made. On December 4, 2017, a search team from the local police department, led by the FBI, found parts of Sydney's body discarded in trash bags on a dirt road north of Nebraska, approximately an hour's drive from the city of Wilbur, where the two suspects lived. Along with Sydney's body, adult toys and artifacts were found, discarded using the same bags in which the young woman's body was wrapped. It was confirmed that the date of death was almost a month prior, and although they could not be precisely sure, forensic studies estimated that her death occurred around the dates Leah organized the dates with the girl. They also stated that the body had bruises all over. Upon the discovery of Sydney's body and the emergence of this evidence, both suspects began to talk, or at least Aubrey did, as Leah seemed to be in shock during all subsequent interrogations and cried while declaring her innocence of the crime, although she was not willing to implicate Aubrey or declare that he had planned the crime. On the other hand, Trail would give various versions and statements that would vary both in the interrogations conducted after the body was found and throughout the judicial process he would face in the coming months. This was further proof to finally classify him psychologically as a pathological liar, that is, a person who lies compulsively. Initially, After being placed in pretrial detention due to evidence suggesting he might try to escape to Mexico, Aubrey confessed that he had killed Sydney on his own and without Bailey's help. In the same statement, the man requested that the law of retaliation be applied. Indeed, he exclaimed that he should be executed for the murder of Sydney Loofe. However, as warrior-like and archaic as this sounded, Aubrey did not stick to his statement and later said that Sydney died after a third date they had, where the three of them were engaged in a threesome. Each one, consensually of course, was fulfilling their fantasies until it came to a point where, again consensually, Sydney's neck had to be tightened a bit. At that moment, Aubrey went too far and the young woman ended up dying from asphyxiation. At some point in this whole snowball of lies created by Aubrey, he began to tell the FBI agents something that wasn't entirely a lie because there was evidence that he did something similar, but not exactly as he told it. This was that he practically dedicated himself to uploading videos on the dark web, and these videos were of him, Bailey, and another girl. In this case, it was believed that Sydney participated in this, as he made them believe, and that these videos were quite perverse, in which clients with strange fetishes paid him to perform all these bizarre acts. Aubrey also said that he used the money he received from these videos to pay different young women to participate and help him make them. He claimed that they were aware that there were practices or fetishes that could result in injuries or even death. He even went so far as to say that Sydney had consented to participate as part of the deal and that he had a video of her consenting to this. But obviously, as this was most likely a lie, such a video could never be seen by any of the authorities to be taken as verifiable evidence. Although Aubrey lied a lot in his statements and often contradicted himself, the authorities had to be attentive to anything that came out of his mouth since he occasionally told the truth, at least partially. For example, in one of his statements, he gave them a clue as to where they could find Sydney's phone, which was in the cemetery of Wilbur. When they went there, the police indeed found the girl's phone, along with her driver's license and credit cards. In 2018, the trial that would decide the fate of the two accused began. On June 11 of that year, the court announced that both Aubrey Trail and his girlfriend Bailey Boswell would face charges of first-degree murder and improper disposal of human remains. The prosecution expressed its plan to seek the death penalty for both due to the gruesomeness of the crime, and because at the final moment of the trial, both defendants decided to plead not guilty. This was likely because their lawyers had a very distorted view of reality and sold their clients the idea that they could go free. During the trial, 3 women who had been involved with the couple testified. Thanks to this, very interesting details were revealed, such as that Aubrey had told them he was a kind of vampire who could read minds and obtained his powers by performing perverted rituals, while also claiming that he could gain more of these powers if he ever managed to kill a woman as part of these rites. One of these women also testified that when she stopped participating in meetings with the couple, Aubrey threatened her, saying he would kill her entire family if she revealed the atrocities that were taking place there. The defendant's lies fell apart when the prosecution's evidence conclusively demonstrated that this crime had indeed been premeditated and planned in advance. Some housekeepers from a nearby motel testified that they had seen Sydney with Bailey and Aubrey at the hotel weeks before the young woman's disappearance. Security cameras from another hotel near Sydney's workplace showed Bailey and Aubrey lurking around the area. On November 15 at around 11 a.m., the couple was seen buying a folding saw and food grinders at a local mall. The prosecution also presented phone tower records indicating that both had been waiting near Sydney's residence in the hours before she went to work on November 15. Apparently, they followed her to her workplace, where another security camera recorded Aubrey entering the hardware store in the afternoon, minutes before Sydney's shift ended, frequently glancing over his shoulder as if monitoring her. There were also security recordings showing Trail purchasing a large saw for wood, large-sized trash bags, and several lighters of bleach at a store. Although many searches were conducted, the saws that Trail supposedly used were never found. They also couldn't find traces of Sydney's DNA on the adult toys that were analyzed and found at the scene where her body was located. This is presumed to be due to the thorough cleaning with bleach that the man had carried out in the entire apartment. However, the FBI found traces of blood and Sydney's DNA on a pair of rubber gloves and on a pair of pants belonging to Aubrey. The same was found on an electrical cord that appeared to be the final cause of death for the 24-year-old woman. Following this, there was not much to be done. Aubrey's defense attorneys had attempted to portray the crime as a perverted threesome gone wrong, but with all the compelling evidence against this idea, it was abandoned. Bailey's defense, on the other hand, had a bit more success. They focused on her troubled adolescence and argued that her role in Sydney's death had been almost forced after being emotionally manipulated by Aubrey, who was twice her age. When the time came for the trial that would determine the final fate of the 52-year-old man, the jury decided that Aubrey Trail would be sentenced to death. This was for charges of first-degree murder and many more, such as conspiracy. Trail's defense attempted to appeal the verdict, but the judge denied this request. Meanwhile, Bailey's defense asked for her final sentence to be postponed for later. In October 2020, a jury sentenced her to life imprisonment for the same charges imposed on Aubrey. Bailey was not given the death penalty because the court considered the circumstances of her young age and the emotional manipulation by Trail in committing these acts. Today, Bailey is incarcerated in a women's correctional center in Nebraska, and Aubrey is on death row, awaiting the fulfillment of his sentence in the coming years. At some point during the trial, specifically when the prosecution began seeking the death penalty for Bailey, Aubrey became very upset because he wanted all the blame to fall on him and not on his partner. At that moment, he caused a scandal in the courtroom. After saying that Bailey did not understand and cursing everyone in the court, he suddenly pulled out a razor blade. It's unclear where he got it from, as he was in court, and attempted to harm himself in an area where he obviously intended to do the most damage. However, he did not die from this act, dispelling any notion that he was a vampire or had any special powers. Sarah Yarboro was born on June 12, 1975, in Portland. Her parents soon moved to another state, settling in Federal Way, a suburb outside of Seattle. Sarah had 2 siblings and was particularly close to her youngest brother. From a young age, she had a passion for music and ballet. She worked hard in school with the goal of attending a good university. Her academic achievements led her to participate in a school program that took her to New Zealand twice. Later on, Sarah joined her high school's cheerleading team and had a wide circle of friends. She was known for her kindness and willingness to help others in need. On the morning of Saturday, December 14, 1991, when she was 16 years old, Sarah had a gathering with her cheerleading team for an event. They were supposed to meet at the school building where the bus would pick them up. She drove her father's car to the school but arrived at the wrong time. She thought the bus would pick them up at 8 a.m., but it was scheduled for 9 a.m. Her friends gradually arrived at the meeting point, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Some students noticed her car in the parking lot, but she wasn't inside. She didn't appear even when the bus arrived for the students. Her friends found this strange, but back then, none of them had mobile phones, so they couldn't contact her. Around the same time, 2 12-year-old children were walking on the school grounds, exploring the wooded area behind the tennis courts. They noticed something unusual. A man emerged from behind the bushes, took a breath, and walked away in the opposite direction. The children found it odd, but didn't pay much attention and continued walking. A few meters ahead, they encountered a horrifying sight. A young woman lying on the ground, unresponsive. They thought she might be dead. The children ran home to tell their parents, and one of the children's parents went back to the scene with them. The other child's father decided to follow the suspicious man they had seen earlier. The child mentioned seeing a car that resembled a Chevrolet Nova leaving the area. Since he lived near the school, his father decided to try to locate that car. At one point, he spotted a similar car but quickly lost sight of it, unable to find it again. Meanwhile, the parents of the other child went to the school and realized that the young woman on the ground was likely deceased. They immediately rushed to the school building and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that the young woman was indeed deceased. They were also able to quickly determine that the deceased was Sarah. The police concluded, based on the marks on her neck, that the victim had been strangled. Some of her belongings were found near her body, including her jacket, underwear, and socks. Strangely, her purse and car keys were discovered in the school parking lot, leading investigators to suspect that the assailant might have attacked her near her car and then dragged her behind the trees. The body was handed over to forensic experts, and the police began their search for clues. Their initial step was to interview all the people who were in the school premises and its vicinity. Two boys who had found Sarah provided a rough description of the man who had emerged from behind the bushes near her body. They described him as a tall man around 20 years old, with shoulder-length reddish hair, dressed in a dark coat and black pants. Soon, the police managed to locate another witness, and here is where a surprising twist in the story unfolds. The man who had gone for a run observed a strange scene in the same wooded area. A girl was lying next to the bushes, and a man was hovering over her. The girl showed no movement at all, and the witness initially thought that a couple had decided to be intimate in that spot. A few minutes later, he ran on the same road in the opposite direction, and both the man and the girl were still there. In both instances, it did not appear to him that a serious crime was being committed. The witness explained to the police that he had recently immigrated to the United States from another culture and was unsure of the typical behavior in the country. Nevertheless, this witness provided the police with a rough description of the assailant, which matched the descriptions given by the children who discovered the body. Investigators interviewed dozens of people who had been near the school but did not find any other useful leads. Meanwhile, medical experts examined Sarah's body and concluded that the cause of her death was strangulation. Apparently, the assailant had used his own socks, and a severe head wound was also found on the girl. Experts believed that the victim had lost consciousness due to this blow, which aligned with the runner's account of seeing the girl lying motionless on the ground. Forensic experts examined Sarah's clothing and found traces of male particles on nearly all of her garments. However, in 1991, there was no DNA database to compare these samples to, so investigators could only rely on direct comparisons of DNA samples from specific suspects. There was another lead that detectives pointed out, although forensic experts found traces of male particles on Sarah's clothing. The forensic doctor stated that there were no signs of sexual assault on her body. With all this information in hand, investigators formed their own opinion of what had happened. Sarah had arrived at the school nearly an hour early, and there was no one else in the parking lot but her. It was most likely that her assailant saw her there, waited for her to exit the car, struck her in the head with an object, causing her to lose consciousness. He then dragged her out of the parking lot behind some trees, where her body would later be found. The assailant had removed some of her clothing and engaged in lewd acts before strangling her with her own socks. When one of the children who discovered Sarah's body reported the car in which the assailant had supposedly fled, detectives initiated a search for a Chevrolet Nova. They quickly found one, but it turned out that the driver of that car had just delivered donuts that morning and provided his DNA sample, which did not match the DNA found on Sarah's clothing. It appeared that the children had simply seen the vehicle driving on the road next to them and mistakenly thought the perpetrator was behind the wheel. In fact, none of the children could remember with exact certainty if they had seen a man approach a car from the bushes. Over the following days, the police officers continued to search for witnesses and new leads, but there were no significant breakthroughs. Classes resumed on Monday, despite the horror that had occurred. Apart from the fact that the murder had taken place just a few meters from their school, the perpetrator remained at large, and his identity was unknown. The girls were afraid to walk alone on the premises, so the boys from the sports teams took it upon themselves to accompany each female student to their car or bus to ensure they weren't left alone on the street. Investigators learned that there were approximately 70 potential witnesses of the school and its surroundings that morning, and they interviewed each one of them, but no new details emerged. Based on the accounts of the two children and the runner, a sketch of the assailant was created and distributed to all local newspapers and television stations. The story received extensive media coverage, and in the weeks that followed, the police received hundreds of tips. Investigators diligently checked each and every one of them, but in every case, they hit a dead end. At one point, they received a lead on a man who matched the murder suspect's description and had a criminal record. However, the detectives were unsuccessful in this lead as well, as his DNA did not match the sample found on the victim's clothing. Since then, the case remained stagnant for months. The police received a total of 4,000 different tips and attempted to work with each one of them, but the resources of the local police department were simply insufficient to handle the volume of information. Time was also working against them, as new cases required the investigators' attention every month. When Sarah's family discovered that the police lacked the resources to manage all the tips, they tried to help as much as they could. One family member worked for a technology company and convinced the company's management to temporarily provide the police department with a powerful computer valued at $150,000. In the 1990s, this was a substantial sum, but the company agreed. With this computer, the police could store information on all the leads in one place, process them more quickly, and categorize them for easy review. Despite their efforts, each lead led to a dead end, and they made no progress in the following years. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, and before their graduation, they decided to commemorate their friend by raising a significant amount of money and using it to create a memorial. It was a bench where Sarah's belongings were cast in metal. Alongside these items was a photo of the girl's dog reaching for her purse. Over the years, the case was periodically reopened, re-examining all available evidence, but the outcome remained the same. They still couldn't get closer to capturing the perpetrator. During this time, the police interviewed several thousand people and collected DNA samples from almost 300 possible suspects, but all efforts were in vain. In 2011, 20 years after the murder, one of the detectives decided to turn to modern technology. He had heard about a company working in the field of genetic genealogy. The detective contacted them and asked, "Can you try to locate the relatives of the person who left their DNA on the victim's body?" The experts took on the task, but unfortunately, they failed. Firstly, in 2011, genetic genealogy was just beginning to gain momentum, and the experts were limited in their capabilities. For example, they couldn't yet search for both male and female relatives within the same sample. If they had DNA from a man, they could only search for familial connections with other men, and vice versa. Secondly, they faced legal obstacles in the form of various laws that prohibited the use of genetic data samples to search for relatives of suspects. However, their efforts did yield some interesting results. On one hand, the team of researchers that the detective approached have been working for several years on creating a genetic pedigree of the first people who arrived in the United States from Britain in 1620 on the Mayflower. After studying the DNA of Sarah's assailant, they discovered that the man was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, tracking him through this lineage was nearly impossible, especially in those years. The Mayflower carried just over 100 people, but over the centuries, the number of their descendants has surpassed 25 million. Secondly, the detective had no idea that he had turned Sarah's case into the first of its kind, even though his initial attempt was unsuccessful. It was the first crime that was attempted to be solved with the help of genetic genealogy. The detective tried to utilize the available information and located several men with the last name Fuller who lived in the area of his city at the time of Sarah's murder. He found photos of them and met with the only witnesses, a runner and two men who had found the body when they were children. Unfortunately, none of them recognized the murderer from the photos. Finally, the investigator requested DNA samples from all the Fullers in the area, and they were sent to the laboratory. None of them matched the DNA of the assailant, but something interesting happened here. The experts discovered that one of these men was indeed a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from the same Mayflower ship. However, he was definitely not the murderer, nor did he know of any distant relative living nearby. It's possible that the perpetrator of the crime was related to him through such a distant relative that their family simply never knew of the connection. The detective retired in 2017, and the case was handed over to a new team of investigators. They reached out to the company that had taken over the study of the DNA sample from the assailant in 2011. By then, the capability to study genetic material had advanced significantly, and the experts agreed to try to trace the assailant's lineage. It took them 2 years of painstaking work, using public databases to find even the most distant relatives of the assailant, then manually tracing their family connections to individuals who lived during the time of Sarah's death. In total, they had to eliminate several thousand individuals before they finally got a break. In September 2019, they came up with 2 new possible suspects, brothers Edward and Patrick Nicholas, who, as the DNA showed, were descendants of Robert Fuller. The experts determined that it was highly likely that a DNA sample from Sarah's clothing belonged to one of 2 brothers. At the time of the murder, one was 33 years old and the other was 27. The older brother turned out to be a career criminal with an extensive history of violent offenses. He had been in prison, and his DNA sample was in the FBI database, which meant he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder because his DNA would have shown a match in the 1990s if he were the perpetrator. As for the younger brother, named Patrick Nicholas, he had also been arrested multiple times by the police for violent crimes, including against minors. However, this was before the DNA samples of such offenders were added to the database. The detectives immediately placed the man under surveillance. Patrick, who was 55 years old at the time, lived in a neighboring city called Wellington. The police had been following his every move for 2 days, and soon, an opportunity presented itself. Patrick went to the laundromat, and while waiting for his clothes to wash, he stepped outside to smoke and discarded a cigarette butt on the ground. One of the officers immediately collected it in an evidence bag and returned to his car. Patrick stepped out to smoke for a second time, and this time, a cloth handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The officers pick it up. The police settled for taking the second piece of evidence in case the experts couldn't extract a DNA sample from the cigarette butt. However, the forensic experts were able to easily obtain samples from all these items, and the following day, they delivered the long-awaited news to the detective. Patrick's DNA was a perfect match with the traces found on Sarah's clothing in 1991. The judge immediately issued an arrest warrant for the man, and the police took him into custody. It took 5 days for the investigators to ascertain his name before formally charging him with murder. When his biography was leaked to the media, many began to ask a perfectly logical question. Why was a man with such a history of criminal activity not even considered a suspect for all these 28 years? At the age of 19, Patrick Nicholas approached a young woman and got into her car, where he attempted to assault her. The victim managed to escape and flee, but she had to jump into a river and swim for a long time to reach a safe distance from her assailant. Patrick spent 4 years in prison before being released. The next offense for which he was arrested occurred in 1994 when he tried to assault a minor. He was detained again, but his DNA was not recorded in any database. The reason is peculiar. The charge for which he was prosecuted was not serious enough to collect DNA, and the police never came across his name in 3 decades. He also did not appear in any of the 4,000 leads obtained over the years. It was also revealed why genetic genealogy experts couldn't trace him back to Robert Fuller. It turned out that Patrick's biological lineage was adopted, and he grew up with the adoptive surname. One of the men who discovered Sarah's body when they were children in 1991 immediately asserted that Patrick was undoubtedly the same killer. He admitted that the incident had deeply affected him. He was only 12 years old when the body was discovered, and the perpetrator had seen his face. For many years, the witness lived in constant fear that the killer would come after him, and only after Patrick's arrest did he finally feel safe. Patrick's trial did not begin until 2023. The man insisted he was innocent, and his lawyer attempted to challenge the main piece of evidence, the DNA. He argued that the presence of Patrick's DNA on the victim's clothing did not prove his guilt, but that argument did not hold. The lawyer also tried to challenge the accuracy of the DNA analysis, but the experts declared such claims to be entirely untenable. Ultimately, Patrick was found guilty of first-degree murder without premeditation. On May 25th, he was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison, making it virtually impossible for him to ever be released. During the sentencing, Patrick showed no emotion, unlike Sarah's family. They also spoke before the judge, thanking everyone involved in the trial and the investigators for bringing the killer to justice, despite his ability to elude it for 28 years. Shelby Erin Von Holt was a cheerful young girl born on September 7, 2000, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, USA. Shelby was the second child in a family that included her mother, Shauna Hartman, father Tody Von Holt, older sister Peyton Hartman, and younger siblings, Devin Von Holt and Isaac Von Holt. Shelby graduated from Troy Center High School in 2018. Over the next 2 years, she worked at a steakhouse and other places while contemplating her desired career path. She seemed to be leaning towards a therapeutic field, although she hadn't yet decided the exact specialty. Living life like any other 20-year-old, Shelby's cheerful personality made her the life of every party. She was ever smiling, loved to dance, sing, and spend time with friends. Interestingly, Shelby was living independently, although the reasons or circumstances for this remain unclear. Although she wasn't particularly active on most social media platforms, her presence on Facebook was notable. She frequently posted cheerful photos, many of which included moments shared with her young niece, Camila, the daughter of her older sister, Peyton. According to her mother, Shelby met another young woman named Valerie Rose Hardick on Facebook. Though Valerie, at 22, was slightly older, the two reportedly never had a close relationship. Little is known about Valerie's life, but it has been rumored that she had a troubled childhood, questionable associations, and potentially some mental health challenges. On June 20, 2021, at 6:48 p.m., a 911 dispatcher received a call from a distressed woman. She managed to convey that she was injured and said that Valerie shot her. Whether she provided her address or if the police traced the call is unclear. However, shortly after, officers from the Fort Wayne Police Department arrived at a residence where Shelby resided. Upon arriving at the scene, officers forced entry into the residence and found Shelby barely conscious, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, surrounded by a substantial pool of blood. While one officer stayed with Shelby, the rest performed what is termed a protective sweep of the residence to ensure no other victims were present and that the assailant or assailants were not still inside. As they awaited the arrival of an ambulance and local firefighters, the officers attempted to provide first aid. A sergeant asked Shelby if she knew who had shot her. She identified Valerie as the perpetrator of the attack. Soon after, emergency medical personnel took over Shelby's primary care, rushing her to the nearby hospital. She was conscious, in critical condition, but still alive. Meanwhile, Shelby's family was informed of the incident, and Fort Wayne Police Department officers began gathering potential evidence from her home. A significant piece of this evidence was a doorbell camera. After an immediate review of its footage, a person of interest was identified, though details were not publicly disclosed at the time. A public appeal was made, urging anyone with pertinent information related to the case to contact the police department or provide details anonymously through Crime Stoppers. In a twist of fate, the day after Shelby was critically injured, a disturbing incident occurred roughly 50 kilometers away in Ohio. Around 10:30 in the morning, the local police department received several calls about a suspicious-looking young woman loitering around a convenience store situated at a gas station. Eyewitnesses claim she had been wandering inside the store and near the gas pumps for about an hour, appearing to try and glimpse the credit card numbers customers were using for their purchases. But that wasn't all. The police county had already received a call from a man who reported the same woman seen earlier at the convenience store. He claimed she had pointed a gun at his back. Shortly after, with precautions taken, police officers arrived at the gas station where the woman was still present, and they proceeded to apprehend her without any violent incidents. The woman was identified as 22-year-old Valerie Rose Hardick. She was in possession of a 9mm handgun, which according to reports matched the weapon used in the assault on Shelby. The name Valerie was the one uttered by Shelby when identifying her attacker. To further solidify the suspicions, Valerie's car was the same one captured by Shelby's doorbell camera, seen leaving the scene moments before the injured young woman's emergency call. Despite the ongoing investigation, Valerie was booked and transferred to the county correctional facility, awaiting her arraignment in the local municipal court. Meanwhile, Shelby was desperately clinging to life. 8 9mm bullet wounds had severely injured her chest and abdomen. Doctors had placed her in an induced coma, doing everything in their power to save her. Regrettably, 3 days after the brutal attack, on June 22, 2021, Shelby's body succumbed to the injuries, and she was declared dead. According to media reports, Shauna, Shelby's mother, mentioned her daughter passed away after undergoing 4 intricate abdominal surgeries that didn't produce the hoped-for outcomes. Shelby received 20 blood transfusions, and the medical prognosis was always grim. If she had survived, doctors believed that Shelby's legs would need to be amputated. One might wonder what could drive a 22-year-old woman to murder another young woman so viciously. Based on the limited details, the only motive the investigators disclosed was jealousy. It was alleged that Shelby was dating a young man to whom Valerie had a strong attachment, although his identity was never revealed. Valerie was charged with criminal assault and aggravated threats. Initially detained in Ohio, she was set a bail of $100,000 for threatening a man at the gas station with a firearm. After the initial legal proceedings in Ohio, Valerie was transferred to Allen County to face charges for the murder of Shelby. In a private ceremony, Shelby Von Holtz's remains were memorialized at a funeral home on June 29, 2021, after which they were cremated. As the judicial process for the murder unfolded at the beginning of 2022, Valerie Rose Hardick entered a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to the murder of Shelby, citing a mental illness as a defense. As part of the agreement, the prosecution dropped an aggravating charge related to the use of a firearm during the commission of the crime, which could have added an additional 20 years to her sentence. Having pleaded guilty, the sentencing hearing was the only step left. This took place in September 2022 in the Superior Court of Allen County. As agreed, Valerie entered her plea as guilty but mentally ill. During the hearing, Valerie's defense attorney tried to present mitigating circumstances. He detailed Valerie's challenging upbringing, marked by the death of her stepmother, abuse from a stepbrother, and a history of mental health issues. However, the prosecutors highlighted the trivial motive of jealousy that led Valerie to take Shelby's life. The prosecution also emphasized Valerie's criminal history, noting its escalation over time. They pointed out that when Valerie murdered Shelby, she was on probation, part of an alternative program due to previous charges. Throughout the hearing, Valerie displayed erratic behavior. At times, she appeared coherent and fully aware of the situation, while at other moments she seemed nervous, distracted, and even smiled at Shelby's family. Still, she answered the court's questions accurately. Media reports did not specify exactly what Valerie said when given the chance to speak, but they did highlight that she never showed remorse or apologized to Shelby's family. Shelby's parents, however, clearly conveyed their profound loss during their victim impact statements. Shelby's father recalled his daughter's love for significant symbols like peace signs and mentioned that at the time of her murder, she was finding her way in life. He reflected on Valerie's demeanor during her guilty plea, stating that just by hearing her voice, one could sense her lack of remorse. The grief-stricken father asserted that by admitting to intentionally killing Shelby, Valerie wore her crime like a badge of honor, which showed clear evidence of her lack of regret. Additionally, Toby stated that while jealousy was presented as Valerie's motivation for killing Shelby, he believed there had to be more to the story that wasn't revealed. Referring to the defense's argument about Valerie's mental illness, Shelby's father pointed out that prisons are filled with people with mental issues. He vowed never to stop seeking answers as to why this tragedy occurred. In a heartfelt reflection, Toby emphasized that there were two tragedies in this case, the first being the shocking and agonizing death of his daughter, and the second being Valerie's choice to forsake her future out of rage. He pointed out that Valerie's children would suffer greatly. It was revealed that at 22, Valerie already had at least 2 children, though no further details about them were made public. The grieving father expressed that the tragedy wouldn't end at the graveyard or in the courtroom, stating that true justice could never be found in such tragedy. However, he shared that he had forgiven Valerie to find peace within himself, feeling that his faith in Christ guided him to this decision. He expressed confidence that Shelby was with God and reiterated his deep love for her. Shauna, Shelby's mother, also shared her sentiments. She fondly remembered her daughter as a princess from the day she was born. She described Shelby as a kind spirit who wouldn't hesitate to help a friend, no matter the distance. Shauna committed to attending all possible appeal hearings that Valerie's defense might initiate in the future. Shauna shared the torment of the memory of her lifeless daughter and the helplessness she felt being unable to protect her. All she could do was lay her head on Shelby's chest as her daughter lay in a medically induced coma. She publicly acknowledged her daughter's courage, as Shelby had managed to name her assailant twice and fought valiantly for her life after being attacked. Shanna detailed Shelby's severe injuries, explaining that her heart was racing so fast that her body couldn't sustain it. Shanna mentioned she didn't seek compensation for her daughter's medical expenses, which amounted to merely $500,000, as these were waived upon Shelby's death. Funeral expenses were around $15,000, but Shanna expressed that she didn't believe she would ever receive compensation and didn't want any money from Valerie. Holding back tears, Shelby's mother expressed that memories were all she had left. She wished she could trade places with her daughter, noting that there were days when the grief was so intense that she couldn't bring herself to get up. After the presentations by the legal representatives and the victims' family statements, the court awaited the verdict from the judge. Given the plea agreement under Indiana law, the sentence could range between a minimum of 45 years to a maximum of 65 years, with the average being 55 years. Valerie's defense asked for the minimum sentence, highlighting various mitigating factors, while the prosecution sought the maximum. Before announcing his decision, the judge stated it was evident the murder was premeditated and Valerie was fully aware of her actions, which was further evident when she fled to Ohio. The judge acknowledged that Valerie might have had a challenging upbringing, facing inadequate education, personal traumas, and mental health issues. However, he emphasized her growing criminal record. At the time of Shelby's murder, Valerie was already facing pending charges for a separate crime. Given her past unsuccessful rehabilitation attempts and criminal background, her trauma couldn't be deemed a viable excuse. Reflecting on these points, the judge sentenced 23-year-old Valerie to the maximum possible sentence of 65 years in prison. He also ordered the destruction of the weapon used in the murder. According to the American Correctional System's records, Valerie is incarcerated in Indiana Women's Prison, with the earliest estimated release date being June 18, 2070, at which time she will be 72 years old. After the court session, Shelby's parents expressed satisfaction with the verdict. However, in later statements, they clarified that no judgment could alleviate their pain. While Valerie would spend her days in prison, Shelby's mother emphasized that she would forever miss and remember her daughter. Interestingly, this case is one of the few where a mortal victim was able to identify her killer. Elaborating on this aspect, a prosecutor, who was not involved in this case, explained that when a dying victim identifies their attacker, such statements are known as dying declarations. These not only provide a starting point for detectives, but also stand as the sole exception to the hearsay rule in court trials, aiming to ensure the most reliable evidence is presented. He also stressed that such dying declarations are admissible in court since they tend to produce more trustworthy statements due to the immense pressure and tragic circumstances surrounding them.